Good morning all. It's a bright Albany morning and we're beginning. I'm Senator James Sanders Jr. and I have some of the finest experts on this issue sitting with me today, and I will introduce them as it goes on. I'm the chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Banks. I am here today because we are going to have, no pun intended, an enlightened conversation focusing on cannabis companies and workers, the lack of access to banking solutions with marijuana still being illegal at the federal level. Let me give you an anecdotal story, actually. California, in their first year of legalization, expected $189 million from taxes. They took in $89 million. Now let's take out some of that was they oversold the issue, as people often do. But two other problems were, one was that the pricing that they gave was not competitive. The street marketeers were more competitive and convenient. Then if that's not enough, without a banking system, people are more apt to not report their income. They did not report everything that they were earning. So it is a real problem that we have to grapple with. If the state legalizes recreational marijuana, we have to figure out the issue of what are we going to do with banking. So we're going to hear from some of the best people on both sides as we go through this symposium. Now, my friends, people are going to come and go during the day of this symposium. People have, there's a very busy day and people will be all over the place, myself included. I will pop out briefly and then pop back in. My colleagues up here may do the same. I've been told that Senator Savino is going to be hardcore. You're going to go the distance. There you go. She hardcore. I commend her. Speaking of Senator Savino, she has worked hard on the issue of medical marijuana and has been a leading voice. She actually converted me to that position. I was staunchly against, and then the argument was so apparent that I had to yield.
Did the stalking help?
Well, well, some may call it stalking. I say it's wonderful, persistent visitations of the stalking variety. So she jokes about it, but her persistence on this and other issues is the thing of legend. Speaking of things of the people of legend, I'm sitting next to Senator Krueger, and whatever she focuses on is indeed focused on. She went from a negative on this issue of marijuana to understanding that indeed it may happen. And not only did she focus, but she found many different approaches that would benefit the ravaged communities, and that is really something that's amazing, and I congratulate her on that one. Senator John Liu proposed the legalization back in 2013.
Still waiting for a free sample.
Well, it's just amazing. He confided and confessed that he has never used the product. But well, it's good to be a geek in this sense. So under those conditions, we have background music too. I like this.
In the mood.
Yeah. Can I you know, I would choose Jimi Hendrix if you were going to speak of this subject. But there I go thinking again. It gets me in trouble. But John Lew actually was one of the first to really work on this issue. I probably voted against it or was against it in 2013 when you were there. Amazing, so much. We have moved so fast and so far in such a short time. Assemblyman, you are more than welcome to join us. I mean, when you have a shirt and tie like that, it's just, you need to be on TV, brother. So under those conditions, we really have to grapple with these things, the question of marijuana. Now, I'm going to yield to my colleagues and see if anyone wants to make a quick opening statement, and then we will start calling witnesses. And by then, Khadija, you will have walked and found out where the music is. It's nice music.
In the well, they're doing
Oh.
some kind of performance.
Oh, then, well, we can close the door. Sadly, although it sounded nice, Senator Kruger, is there a statement that you would like to make?
Hi. Good morning, everyone. Well, I appreciate Senator Sanders hosting this event because it's a really important issue to figure out in the context of expanding a legalized marijuana program in the state of New York. I carry a bill that would legalize and regulate marijuana for adult recreational purposes. It didn't get done in the budget. Some of us thought it might, so now we need to move it forward through as a freestanding bill. But the priority for me with this bill has always been not necessarily encouraging anyone to use cannabis. My colleague Senator Lew has never used it. I last used it when I was 19 years old. It was 1976, Rocky Horror Picture Show, original opening, Chicago, to put it in historical context. And I have no interest in using it again since then. But since my goal with legalized adult use is to recognize, one, it is used by large numbers of people. Two, it should not be part of the criminal justice system where hundreds of thousands of people have actually been arrested for personal use cannabis, primarily people who are brown and black, primarily young adults whose lives may actually be ruined and certainly radically changed because of their involvement with the criminal justice system. For what purpose? Absolutely no purpose, other than we have antiquated prohibition laws. So I very much want to see this regulated, legalized the way we handle, for example, alcohol products, and that there be a system of business models developed with particular focus on communities who were harmed by prohibition. So we want to make sure that we are able to start small businesses in poor inner city and rural communities. We want to make sure that we have all kinds of licenses so that people can get into different parts of the business. And frankly, if we don't figure out the mechanisms by which there is financial interchange between the clients, the customers, the different companies, we are at a real disadvantage. So what do we know? We know that we still have a federal law that says whatever you states are doing, we, the federal government, don't recognize it, and it's not legal. And so there are real concerns out there about how you create banking relationships if you're in the cannabis business, how you are able to pay people legally on the books if you're in the cannabis business. And interestingly, because we've watched other states around the country, no one's necessarily mastered it, and yet there are huge numbers of businesses operating successfully in various states around the country. And there are huge numbers of people whose income is derived from a state legal model, regulated adult use and or medical, despite the fact that we still have federal laws and federal banking laws that lead one to believe there's no way to get this done. And yet we hear all the time, if you're a big enough company, you figure it out. I think for New York, going forward, we want to make sure we actually can come up with a system where even if you're a small startup business in a poor community, you also have a way to figure it out. And these are many different levels, so it's how do you actually sell the product? Can you sell for cash, or does it have to be credit card? There are disadvantages to both and advantages to both. Are you paying people through a cash system, which is in fact much more complicated for them and for tracking benefits? I mean, there's a reason most American workers are paid through some kind of automatic paycheck and paycheck deductions, because it's simpler and cleaner for the company, and actually simpler and cleaner for the employee. So we want to, I think, make sure that that's possible, Senator Sanders. We certainly don't want the stories that were coming out of at least California for a while, where companies were taking bags of cash to City Hall to pay their taxes and saying, here's somebody, here's my taxes. And people at City Hall being like, we don't have a cash acceptance system at City Hall. And most people, at least in this town, would start to giggle about the corruption potential of having a cash and carry system and dealing with government. So we want to make sure that we've figured that out as well. So I don't have a lot of the answers other than anecdotal from parts of the country where it seems to work or not work. And I do think it's important, so thank you for bringing people together and saying what best practices have worked in other places that we could try to replicate here, or do we need to set up a whole different system for New York State as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you kindly. Khadija, you have the unlikely fun of making sure that the door is closed if the music comes back. Yours is the job of making sure that that door stays closed. I was with the Commissioner of Cannabis Control from Massachusetts over the weekend, and I want to thank you for your support on that, Senator Kruger. And it was very interesting where she is saying that the arrests of brown and blacks are still taking place over that stuff. That even after you've legalized it, the arrests are still going on, and she's saying that it's starting to spike, which means that we really got to think this thing through somehow. We have to think it through. But one of the best minds on this has been Senator Savino. Senator Savino.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. And I also want to thank you for convening this meeting of people who are interested in trying to solve the complex problems that a cannabis industry faces and creates for policymakers. I also want to thank Senator Kruger for her efforts to try and bring a legal adult use market to New York State. And I know a lot of people have, recently been somewhat disappointed that we didn't get it done in the budget. And I have tried to remind people, no state has done an adult use marijuana bill legislatively. And I'm going to repeat that. No state has done this legislatively. It has always been done by public referendum. So the idea of legislators getting together and doing this is really very difficult, because legislators are usually not as far ahead as their constituents are on issues. So what Senator Kruger and Assemblywoman Crystal Peoples-Stokes are facing is, a very steep hill. So I'm there to support her in every way possible. But no one should think that this was not a Herculean effort to begin with, and it's going to take some time. We still are facing a lot of challenges among policymakers around the state. I said when I took on the issue of medical marijuana in 2013 that we were going to do three things. We were going to create a public health policy, we were going to reform our penal code, and we were going to create a new industry. But most importantly, we were also going to begin to re-socialize the way people think about marijuana. And that's what we're doing. New York State became the 23rd state to adopt a medical marijuana program, and I think we all have to start calling it cannabis, right? It's hard. We interchange it. I would personally prefer if the media would stop calling it pot, weed, or all the other euphemisms they use for marijuana, because quite honestly, I think it demeans the whole public health aspect of it. But we became the 23rd state, and when we did that, you know, in an effort to try and look at best practices, I did what Senator Kruger's doing now. I went to other states, and what Senator Sanders is doing, I looked at other states. What did they do? What worked? What didn't work? What would New York State want to import into our system, knowing the kind of regulatory structure we might want to adopt? And I think that's the way you have to do it. At the same time, we had a somewhat more favorable federal environment. Not to say that the Obama administration was pro-cannabis. They really weren't. But they weren't overtly hostile. And we were operating under the Cole Amendment that said marijuana is still a Schedule I substance, which means it has no legitimate purpose. It's illegal. However, if you make it legal in the four walls of your state, here's some guidelines to follow, and we won't come in and shut you down. And so there was some sense that if we created a system that worked within those boundaries, that we would be safe. But yet and still, banks in this state have been less than willing to lend. Certainly they won't lend, they won't bank, they won't open accounts for the industry. We had one attempt, SEFQ tried to do it, I think back in 2015, and somehow or other that didn't work out too well. And so it's left the industry, just like in other states, trying to come up with creative ways to do their banking. And it's not just about where they put their money and how they get their money out. It's how do they deal with their payroll, which is a complex problem for an industry that employs a lot of people. Now, it's maybe not that big here in New York, but in other states, they have thousands of employees. So how do you deal with your payroll issues? How do you pay your taxes? I've been to Nevada. I've seen them, actually, and Colorado. I've seen them deliver boatloads of cash to the Department of Tax and Finance. And just imagine they come in with these buckets of cash, which, by the way, generally smells, because they have to keep the cash in the same vault where they keep the product. And now everybody that works in the Department of Tax and Finance has to stop and begin to count the money. It's an absurd system. But you move beyond that. It's not just the mechanics of going through this. Because the federal government continues to consider this an illegal substance, and they will not legalize the financial practices in the industry, they're also subject to a much higher tax standard, which raises the bar for so many people who are trying to get into this industry. Those of you who followed our efforts during the budget process to try and create an adult use market heard over and over that there's a lack of diversity in this industry, that there's a lack of mom and pop stores in this industry, that you have to be fully liquidated and have a lot of money to get into this business. And that's very true. And one of the reasons why is because it's very expensive to stay in this business. I'm just going to give you like one statistic on the tax issue. So let's assume you're a cannabis business and your gross revenue is $1 million. And you're a non-cannabis business. Your gross revenue is $1 million. Your cost of goods sold are $650,000. Non-cannabis business, cost of goods sold, $650,000. Gross income, $350,000. Gross income, $350,000. Deductible business expenses for a cannabis industry, $0. Deductible business expenses for a non-cannabis industry, $200,000. Taxable income for a cannabis business, $350,000 total. So everything you make is taxable. You get no deduction. The costs continue to go up. You have nowhere to bank it. If you do find an institution, a financial institution that's willing to service you, the costs are prohibitive, and it becomes more and more expensive every day. Now, the solution to these problems could be maybe found here in a state-chartered bank. I think that's something we've explored, we could think about. The real solution, of course, is Washington. There have been some hearings in Washington. I know recently there is a bill before the House that would at least provide some protection for banks, or a safe harbor law, so that the industry could be serviced by the banking institution. There's a Marijuana States Act that basically would say, we're not going to legalize it on the federal level, but whatever the states do, we'll take our foot off your neck. Something has to happen. There is what I call a cognitive disconnect in Washington with respect to marijuana policy. More than 350 members of Congress live in states that have a legal marijuana program. 350 members of Congress. And if you ask them, they'll tell you they can't vote. They can't take a vote on marijuana policy. Makes absolutely no sense. So it's left to the states to try and figure out how to do this. They say states are the incubator of ideas, and I guess in this instance, we're the grow house of ideas. So I thank you all for, your efforts to help us create a successful medical program here in New York State, which we need to expand, but also to build the discussion around how to create a legal, regulated market. And the final point that I just want to say, you said you were in Massachusetts, and the arrests of people continue. Because I think the belief that once you create a legal regulated market, the illegal market goes away. It doesn't. It will if you create enough opportunity, if it's fair, if the price points are appropriate, if you don't tax the product too high. Otherwise, you drive people right back into the illegal market. And we will have achieved nothing then. So I think that's what we should focus on. How do we create opportunity at every level? How do we create a fair system? And how do we make sense out of what is almost the, what's the word? Nonsensical? Nonsensical? Nonsensical. Thank you.
Well put. I've often thought of the cannabis industry as I am reminded of how the state dealt with illegal gambling and created lotto and other OTB. And those are perhaps ways that we need to look at this. Senator Liu, I believe that you have some insights.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I thank you for your introductory comments about my work a number of years ago when I was a city official. And the impetus of my work on this issue was the extremely disparate impacts on communities of color. Almost all the people who were being arrested for marijuana possession were people of color, even though the vast majority of users were white. And as I looked more and more into the issue, it was very eye-opening. It was eye-opening in that much of the medical and scientific community endorsed the legalization of marijuana for the simple fact that it's not as dangerous or addictive as alcohol, and just from a public policy point of view, it didn't make sense that there was no prohibition on alcohol and yet a continuing prohibition on marijuana. And another simple fact is that a very high level of usage in New York City and probably in the rest of the state as well, despite the prohibition. So the prohibition is not working. Why not regulate it, try to take the criminal element out of it, and also raise revenues for example, for sending kids to college, perhaps reducing tuition at CUNY and SUNY all the way down to zero, maybe. The point was to send kids to college instead of to prison or to give them criminal records. And so I think at this point, after we'd be taking the lead of many other states in decriminalizing the recreational use of marijuana. But I think it's prudent that we hold hearings like this to explore the practical impacts and the things that need to be done in preparation for legalization so that we don't have some of the issues and problems that other states have encountered. A number of people have called for the orderly transition into legalization of marijuana, and I think that's a prudent order of events to follow. So I applaud you for holding this symposium, Mr. Chairman. I, like many of the other members, have a number of hearings and votes. In fact, I have to follow Senator Krueger to our Finance Committee vote shortly. But I certainly will be in and out because this is a very important and timely topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. A rising star in the Assembly and a leader in several fields, including financial technology, and cyber security, fintech, all of this, is Assemblymember Clive Vernell. Assemblymember, would you care to say something?
Firstly, I'd like to thank Senator James Sanders Jr. for having the vision to put together this hearing on cannabis and the banking symposium. I'd also like to recognize Senator Krueger and my majority leader, Crystal People-Stokes, for leading the way to usher in recreational use cannabis in the Empire State, in New York State. And that can't go unsaid and unrecognized. Recreational cannabis is about a lot of things, and you've heard a lot of things here today. You heard about criminal justice, which is very important. The minority communities have been adversely impacted by the criminal justice system with respect to cannabis, and this has been happening for generations. And we must properly make sure that we in New York State address these inequities in the criminal justice system. But this is about, and we also talked about economic opportunities, which is important. As Senator Savino said, that we've had, medical marijuana legalized in New York State, and the economic opportunities for women-owned businesses, for minority businesses have been scant. Very important for us to get it done properly with recreational use marijuana. We have to make sure that, we set up the rules. We set up the parameters. How do we do that right? And how do we do it equitably so more people have the opportunity to engage in the business? We spoke about the federalism issue. The difference between federal government and the state governments. The difference between how the federal government views an industry and how the states views the industry. But here we're speaking about banking, the banking system, and the ability for companies in this space to be able to receive value, to exchange value. What happens when the federal government doesn't recognize such industry? As chair of the subcommittee on Internet and New Technologies, and I'm sitting on the opposite side of Senator Sanders, is the chair of that committee in the Senate side. How do we look at technology and financial technology to close these gaps? Are we looking at cryptocurrency to see which is interesting to see how New York State this year, we passed the first law in the country to create a digital currency task force to study these very issues, to study how cryptocurrencies and these kinds of, and blockchain technology can close the gap for the underbanked and unbanked.
On the floor today.
Great.
In the Senate.
Oh, that's really good. So how can cryptocurrencies, how can blockchain technology work in this space? Very interesting questions to see. And that's why, and very interesting to see how, the banking system works with these financial, with fintech in this space, and with these kinds of industries. So that's why I'm here. I'm also interested in a whole host of things, but what's great is that we don't have all the answers, and we have to be humble enough to be able to wrestle with these questions, and to be able to talk to the community, to be able to talk to industry, to be able to speak to technologists, to speak to people in the banking industry, to speak to people in the cannabis industry to help figure this out, because, we, as the Empire State, we have to get it right, and, but we have to take the leadership and have hearings like this, so that's why I'm here, and, thank you for hosting this.
Thank you, sir. There are a few ways of getting it right, but there are many ways of getting it wrong. And just yesterday, we're hearing that Nassau County and other places are deciding what they want to do if this business becomes legal. And I personally don't have a problem with people deciding. I think that it is a responsible way, but we should decide based on facts and not fear. And we should not pander to people's fear, but address their concerns straightforward. I saw a statement of some person saying that legalization will increase homelessness, and I would love to see the source that they are citing. I would love to see suicides and homelessness. Come on, my friends, there are ways of dealing with this in a responsible fashion. And with that in mind, how's that for a lead-in? With that in mind, we will bring before us Melissa Moore, who is the Deputy State Director of the New York Drug Policy Alliance. She can come and join us down here. She can be joined by Krista Bencola, and she's a lawyer with the same alliance, I believe. And let's see, I'm gonna stop there for a moment, and we're going to go for a few minutes and hear your testimony. And you can begin as you see fit. I always
Oh, is there a
check
mic?
all mics.
Can they go up to the dais?
To testify from up there? But then I guess we'll see you on the screen then. Okay, all right.
Sure, why don't you come and join us?
Yeah.
You always wanted to legislate? Well, this is now your moment.
The pay sucks, though.
Yeah.
Just a joke, just a joke.
No, it's not. You should test your mics first and make sure, pull them towards you and make sure they're working as close as you can get, and speak a little, let's see.
Hello,
Now
testing.
that works, how about yours?
Good morning.
Very, please, ladies.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Senator Sanders and Senator Savino, Assembly Member. It's wonderful to be here today. We really appreciate you taking the time to have this very considered and thoughtful conversation on precisely some of the more complicated issues having to do with adult use cannabis regulation. So just starting initially to frame the conversation a bit, as you discussed already, there are multiple national issues at play, but we also know that cannabis is the most commonly used illicit drug in the country, and that also there's a record 66% of Americans that now support legalization. It's 2/3 here in New York State, and also very strong support, despite some of the fear-mongering that's happening, actually very high support in the latest Quinnipiac poll for having a dispensary located in one's community, even in suburban areas in the state. And we also know that the legalization of cannabis has really significant implications for our economy here in the state, of course. Nationally, the industry totaled more than $8 billion in sales in 2017. They're estimated to reach about $11 billion this year and $23 billion by 2022. That's a lot of cash.
Yes.
Right. And it's also one of the fastest growing industries in terms of who's employed in the entire country. It's growing at twice the rate of tech right now, in part because this has been an underground economy for a long time, and so you're having people come online into the formal sector. But as we're doing that, precisely the concerns around payroll, how do folks who are going to apply for a loan and are working at a dispensary, how are they able to prove their income and things of that nature. So Christina will get into a lot of the Controlled Substances Act detail, but just really quickly touching on the fact that at the federal level, this is classified as a Schedule I substance, which makes it a federal crime to grow, sell, or possess cannabis. And yet, we have 10 states in the district that have legalized adult use and regulated it and brought it into a controlled system. So how do we square those two different things? We know that among the states that have legalized, there's this conflict, and that's led to a variety of constraints on the industry's growth. Where the Obama administration, as you mentioned, Senator, tried to reconcile some of that a little bit, where the Department of Treasury and legal guidance from DOJ led to the Cole memo, basically saying hands off, as long as an entity is in compliance with state law, that the federal government wouldn't intervene and DOJ wouldn't intervene, but that if there was an entity that was breaking the law at the state level, that DOJ had the purview to be able to come in there. Unfortunately, Jeff Sessions, former Attorney General, rescinded that, and there hasn't been a whole lot of clarification since then. There was some brokering as a result of holding up judicial nominees that led to a bit of somewhat of a deal, but it's tenuous, as you said. And we know that even where it's legal under state law, banks and other financial institutions can face penalties for working with cannabis businesses. And that's where a lot of the FinCEN requirements come in. That's the national monitoring of potential financial crimes. And despite that, we also know that there are actually quite a few, hundreds of financial institutions that are actually banking with cannabis businesses right now. And most of those are entities that are not federally chartered, that are state chartered, a lot of credit unions, in fact, that are actually providing depository services, but only 30% of cannabis businesses have access to traditional banking services at this point, which is obviously a problem. Banks that do work with cannabis businesses also face high costs, and in part that's because those funds have to be kept completely separate from any other funds that the bank holds, which is more feasible to do for a smaller entity than it is for a large kind of Chase or Wells Fargo entity, for example. And moving forward, we also know that small business owners need access to lending. And so far, even in the states that have legalized where you do have depository services from some entities, we haven't cracked the code necessarily of how you actually provide some of those startup loans. When we're looking at what it would take for a small business to purchase processing equipment or be able to sign a lease on a retail location, those are obviously things that require a certain amount of capital to begin with. And whereas we know it's also consistently a barrier for entrepreneurs of color to be able to access any form of capital in that way and have that liquidity, it's even more of a challenge in this sense. So those are things that clearly need to be addressed here and that New York can actually be the leader on, especially when we think about some of the entities that are already operational in the state and that are already servicing precisely the communities that we need to be sure are connected up with those access points to capital, like CDFIs in the state, of which there are many. They particularly focus on banking and providing capital services for communities that tend to be marginalized from the normal banking structures, and have shown a great interest in lending in the cannabis space as well. These are a lot of ongoing conversations that advocates are having with financial entities like this that do serve communities to try to find what some of these solutions can be so that folks can have access on the very front end, and want to make sure that we're not getting to a point where we legalize for adult use and yet we're waiting multiple years for some of that tax revenue to come in to be able to give grants back to communities and or provide financial options for people, that we have those on day one.
Can I ask a question, Melissa? So years ago, it's like, I feel like it's 1,000 years ago, I chaired the banking committee at one point, I think 2 chairmen back from Senator Sanders. And I did a series of hearings on lack of access to capital and credit for MWBEs, just in general, forget about the cannabis industry.
Right.
And one of the things is, of course, CDFIs and their ability to lend. But they seem to be undercapitalized themselves. So assuming the state were to put money in to help create this pool of money, how would lending from them or lending by them to the cannabis industry, would that not run afoul of federal banking laws, though? Are they not covered by the same rules?
So they would be able.
How would it work?
My understanding is that they would be able to navigate that somewhat differently because of the state charter that they're issued. And so, for example, Governor Cuomo, I believe it was actually 2 years ago now, when he issued a directive encouraging,
I have
of
it
course,
here somewhere.
right, exactly, encouraging all the state chartered entities to bank for medical marijuana companies and hemp companies operating in the state. As you said before, that didn't necessarily lead to the uptick in banking services that one would have hoped. But yet, I think there is a real interest and appetite on the part of the CDFIs, at least some of the larger players in New York State, to try to figure out how to navigate this best, given what we know about the compliance and regulatory hurdles that they face, but yet really trying to figure that out. And I would also note that there's been some really great work in this area in Massachusetts. As our neighbor, we could look to them, as an example of some community credit unions that have made the transition, that really had no contact previously or understanding of what it would take to bank the cannabis sector, doing that heavy lift internally, but figuring out what they would need to change in terms of their holdings of their assets and just the structure of the way they operated and gave services to folks that allowed them to be able to do that and make that transition relatively seamlessly. So I think that's a great learning opportunity for us.
And I think
in New York.
Massachusetts is too soon to really analyze the success or failure. It's only been operational, what, about 6 months now?
Right, a pretty brief window, but in terms of the banking, that led the charge a little bit, because as we have entities applying for licenses,
Right.
they were trying to get their financial ducks in a row even prior to opening their doors. So I agree that in terms of the overall outcome of the program, it's still early days that we can make, kind of guarded assessments of.
Right.
But I think in terms of looking at, some of the progress that they've made on this issue, it would behoove us to be able to look at that
interesting.
example. I'm going to
Should look
pass
at that.
to Christina, who can talk in some more detail about the federal. It's a really.
There we go. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Christina Bucola, and I don't work for DPA, but I'm in private practice, and I do work as part of the Start Smart campaign here in New York. I am in private practice prior to having a law firm that's dedicated completely to cannabis and hemp. I was the general counsel of High Times, and I was also a partner in a state legal cannabis operation out west. So I've seen cannabis from multiple sides. And thank you, Senator Savino, for setting up all of the major pieces of legislation that I'm going to discuss perhaps in a little bit of greater depth today. We all know that the Controlled Substances Act reigns supreme, and that is the linchpin of all of our banking problems. It is illegal 100%, no ifs, ands about it. And as early as 2009, the Department of Justice really started to sense this tension between state legal businesses and federal prohibition under the CSA. And the first memo that came out prior to Cole was the Ogden memo, and it started to shape these priorities of the federal government to determine what banking was what cannabis companies were state compliant and those that weren't. It looked at, whether there was unlawful use of firearms or violence or sales to minors and other non-compliant activities like money laundering or having excessive amounts of cannabis in store over state allowances, which would indicate out-of-state diversion. And then as states continued to consider adopting larger, more commercial enterprises related to cannabis, the DOJ issued its first Cole memo, because there are actually two, and again, it reiterated the priorities of the Ogden memo, and then the Cole memo that we all know and love was actually Cole 2, and that really clarified the 8 priorities of the federal government. As you said, as long as these 8 priorities are being met, this is really up to the states to police this. We still reserve the right to come in and oversee these activities, but really this is a state's right. So the 8 were wanted to prevent cannabis distribution to minors, revenues from going to illicit cartels, crime syndicates, and gangs, to prevent diversion from to states that did not have cannabis programs, or really any state outside of the state, for cannabis industries acting as illegal fronts, again, with the guns and the violence, keeping that out of the cannabis industry, to prevent drug driving and other public health concerns related to consumption, and to prevent cannabis possession and consumption on federal land. So we've had this framework ever since 2009, and it really gave parameters to those who were acting in the medical, and it's important to stress that these were parameters only for the medical cannabis community. But it gave people comfort. And then, of course, in the beginning of 2018, Jeff Sessions came in and he rescinded the memo. But what ended up happening is it still was good law. I mean, it was never law. It was still good guidelines and good principles to follow. And most of the U.S. attorneys in their district said afterwards, well, we're going to continue to use that as some kind of bright line test. And in fact, the Cole memo, those 8 priorities, are still relevant today, even though that memo has dropped out, because it does serve as some of the backbone of FinCEN, which I'll discuss in a minute. So FinCEN is a financial crimes enforcement network, and it is one of the the federal agencies tasked with overseeing the Bank Secrecy Act, which is to prevent money laundering and other illicit crimes dealing with finance. And so on February 14th in 2014, FinCEN issued its own guidance regarding the Bank Secrecy Act and how FinCEN would start to enforce the Bank Secrecy Act in light of state legal cannabis businesses. So what FinCEN said was, know thy customer and know their business. That's basically the principles around this. And what that means is they said you got to verify, or financial institutions who wanted to bank the cannabis industry needed to verify with appropriate state authorities and agencies that the business was licensed. They have to review the license application, requesting all information possible, really doing thorough diligence, developing an understanding for the client's business so that they would be able to flag any kind of random transactions or problematic transactions that didn't really foot with the day-to-day of the business. And then a continuing ongoing monitoring of publicly available sources and also for suspicious activities, and refreshing this on a periodic basis. This was not, oh, you did it once and it's over. This is an ongoing obligation. And as part of this, FinCEN established 3 different types of suspicious activities reports, which banks are required to file when it is related to cannabis. The first, and this is their term, not our term, as you said, we prefer to use cannabis, but the Marijuana Limited Suspicious Activity Report, which I'll also call a SAR. And that's for a client that seems to be in step with all federal priorities of the Cole Memo and state law. And again, we see that the Cole Memo is still a principle here because those eight priorities are still really important. And the only reason that this suspicious activity report is being filed is because it relates to a cannabis business, but not for it being a cannabis business. Everything seems to be copacetic and in step. The next is the marijuana priority SAR, and that's filed where cannabis clients may not be living up to the letter of the law, or they might be violating some of the Cole Memo's 8 federal priorities. And then there's the marijuana termination SAR, and this is where, after careful diligence, it's almost undoubtedly that the cannabis enterprise is engaging in behavior it shouldn't, and it will give the financial institution the ability to terminate that relationship with the client, and it puts other financial institutions potentially on notice that this activity has gone on. So this is a process that demands a lot of diligence and a lot of resources. Mm-hmm. So that, as you mentioned, the fees associated with these kinds of banks are incredibly high, and it puts it out of the reach of a lot of people.
Another barrier to entry into this market.
Correct. And as Melissa mentioned, most of these banks or financial institutions are only providing depository services, right? And to create collateral could potentially jeopardize that collateral and puts it at risk of seizure from the federal government. So when we talk about creating state banks, that is part of the way, but there will likely be a point at which those closed systems will need to interact with some kind of federal banking. The other agency we talk about is the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is a state agency that gives deposit insurance to its members, and all federally and nationally chartered banks, and most state chartered banks need to have FDIC insurance, which is where this gets problematic is because FDIC members who engage in unsafe and unsound practices are at risk for FDIC enforcement. But of course, it doesn't really define what unsafe and unsound is, and it's generally thought to be committing violations of law. Again, we go back to the Controlled Substances Act as a linchpin, where if you are engaged in this business, you are violating law.
All the cash.
Right. Credit unions are not supervised by the FDIC. I think that there is someone later who's going to be discussing credit unions, so I'll let him take the lead on that. But the deposits in credit unions are insured by the National Credit Union Administration, which has gone on record saying it follows FinCEN guidelines. And what we've also, the barriers to entry may have some alleviation, or banking may be alleviated by, and you alluded to this, Senator Savino, the SAFE Act of 2019, which is the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act. Mm-hmm. And this will enable depository institutions and banks to provide financial services to state legal and state compliant operators without fear of retribution from the federal government. And the financial services include financing sources for cannabis operators, like extending credit and servicing loans, and financial advisory services, including providing credit counseling, services to assist with debt management and debt settlement, modifying the terms of extension of credit, and avoiding foreclosure. So it's not even just going beyond depository, it's also providing a wholesale solution for maybe smaller business owners who need that kind of counseling and haven't been provided with it before. We also have, that is currently being discussed, is the States Act, which would exempt from the Controlled Substances Act the activities of state legal and state compliant cannabis businesses, and could potentially alleviate them as well. So these are all wonderful, and we hope they go through, but even if they do, certain smaller businesses, minority and women-owned businesses, are going to continue to face banking problems and financing problems, in part because they may not have a credit history, and their credit history is going to figure very heavily into whether or not they themselves can get loans and lines of credit for their business. And I just do want to point out, by listing some of the more recent transactions that are, many of our MROs are medically registered organizations under the Compassionate Care Act, it's very easy for most of them to raise money. For example, Acreage Holding, that is New York Canna, the botanist, on November 13th, they raised $314 million ahead of their Canadian stock exchange. Columbia Care, they were valued at $1.35 billion in a go public transaction. Curaleaf, which was Polyatech, in October of this year, they closed $520 million offering and began trading on the Canadian Securities Exchange. Ianthus, which is Valley Agriceuticals, they raised $35 million by convertible notes and warrants in this year in March on the 18th, and then last year in May, they raised $40 million by issuing other convertible notes and warrants, and also by issuing additional units. And then MedMen, which was formerly Bloomfield Industries, just recently, this made a lot of news, Gotham Green Partners was set to invest up to $250 million in them. And, in October of last year, they raised $94 million with a senior secured term loan. Verio Health, they announced a closing of an initial tranche of $16 million in August. So we have players that are already very well entrenched in private markets or in the Canadian market, where they can essentially raise capital like this. And so one of the things that we have to really pay attention to is, how can New York State support those smaller businesses through agencies that are already in place, and also by thinking outside of the box.
Thank you. I just want to mention that we have been joined by Senator Simca Felder, to my right over here. And I see up in the audience up there, Assemblymember Charles Fall from Staten Island. He would come down here, but apparently he injured himself during the budget process, fighting for the people of Staten Island, and something happened to his knee. He had to have surgery. So you just stay right there where you are, Charles. Take care of it. Would you like to say something, Senator Felder? So, first of all, ladies, thank you for your testimony. Senator Sanders had to step out to the Banking Committee. Senator Kruger went to the Finance Committee. They'll both be back. But I want to follow up on some of the things you said. You guys have encapsulated what I said numerous times is one of the biggest challenges in this industry, is how expensive it is. How difficult it is once you get a license. I don't care what state you're in. Once you're able to secure a license, how complicated it is to maintain that license, and how difficult it is to continue to raise money. You need to have a network of very wealthy friends, and there is a whole hedge fund industry involved in this now. I've attended a few events. There's an organization called Green Tables, and they basically are hedge fund operators who are very interested in financing in this industry, and they're investors. It was a really weird experience, to be in a room full of extraordinarily wealthy people who just want to, finance the industry. But that's at this level.
Right.
It's at the local level that we have not seen that. And the New York medical program has become even more expensive, which requires a higher level of fundraising that you need to do and to maintain more liquidity, because ours is a vertically integrated model. We did not require that in the statute. That was required by the regulations. And for the medical program, they may prefer it that way. And if you saw in the governor's proposal and in Senator Kruger and Assemblywoman People-Stokes' bill, they don't require vertical integration. In fact, they go in the exact opposite direction because you want to create various entry points in the marketplace so you have more diversity of not just the individuals, but also of financial ability so that you can do that. And I think that has to be the way you move forward on, certainly on adult use. But even on the medical side, there's some concern, not all of the entities in New York State are wealthy.
No.
And in fact, of the first 5 that received a license, I think only 3 of them are still here. They were purchased by other entities who came into New York State because it's very complicated. So even if you walk in the door fully capitalized, it's hard to stay that way in an environment where banking is a challenge, tax law is a challenge, an uncertain federal environment continues to be a challenge, and you also have a regulatory structure that narrowed not only where you could operate, but how many people you could serve, you know, and I often likened it to the casino industry but once we legalized casinos in New York State, anybody who over the age of 18 could walk through your front door. We not only said, okay, here's who can walk through your front door, and here's where your front door is gonna be, which made it even more complicated and more expensive. So I thank you ladies for your input and your work on this effort, and I certainly look forward to working with you guys on this in the future. I don't know who he has next, so I'm just going to pull over his
Can I just
piece
add
of paper. Yes, you
one
guys have more?
additional note?
Absolutely.
Yeah, just on the CDFIs, to your prior question, the CDFI fund in New York State is definitely underfunded
Yes.
from what it should be. You know, from when the CDFI fund was established in 2007, it's consistently
Did
not.
we ever actually fund it?
I don't think we
I don't
ever
think we
did.
did.
So.
We never
I don't
did.
think so. And yet, the CDFIs are serving 82, there are 82 CDFIs serving every county in New York State. And if we look at, you know, what an injection of, say, $25 million into the CDFI fund would be, that would mean $300 million in direct lending and services that would be able to be leveraged by those entities all across the state. So, you know, in 2015, the CDFIs in New York invested more than $2.5 billion across the counties of New York State, which, you know, going back to the fact that they were never properly funded in the first
Right.
place is pretty remarkable. But when we think about, you know, what could actually happen if we were to properly fund that as a vehicle to potentially work with like an incubator program
Right.
within the adult use space that, you know, would also not just be about the funding vehicle or the financial mechanism, but would also provide, you know, proper counseling, small business assistance, coaching.
Which is critical in this business.
Exactly, which is super important. And not everybody necessarily will need that coming into the space, but for people who do, it's vitally important to be able to have those services. So we know that the MRTA does establish an incubator program that would provide a lot of those technical assistance pieces to people coming into the space. And we need to figure out, you know, if there is a mechanism already at our availability to be able to leverage in that regard, it makes a lot of sense to use it.
If you are in an ancillary industry, like you're an attorney for the cannabis industry, are you affected by the restrictions on banking laws? So like, for instance, in Nevada, they decided that they would issue licenses to people where 50% of their business was dedicated to the cannabis industry. So if you're an attorney servicing cannabis businesses, if you're an accounting firm, have you encountered any issue with
I
respect to
haven't.
that?
No, I haven't, but that's because I have a law practice, and that's because, you know, none of my clients have like green bud thumbs industry, you know, they all have corporate name. That also, I'm not gonna lie, the nomenclature of your clients also has a lot to do with banking and the name of, because that is part of the research that they do. I have not been personally impacted by it, but I certainly have had clients have their accounts closed down at numerous different,
Really?
Yeah.
And this is true even in terms of what it would be for an ancillary business or even a nonprofit entity that works within the cannabis space on social media platforms, for example. Like we have allies at the Cannabis Cultural Association, which is focused on bringing folks from impacted communities into cannabis business And they're repeatedly flagged and banned on Facebook and on Instagram and on other platforms, despite the fact that they're non-plant touching in any sense. They're an advocacy organization. And they also struggled to just be able to get a depository bank account for themselves. So that's not even a plant touching entity that we need to
Right.
consider as well. But there are obviously tremendous opportunities in the ancillary space as well. In as much as there's tremendous growth in the cannabis industry, there's exponential opportunities outside of it as well. When we think about what an entire industry will spawn in terms of the economic engine that comes out of that, and making sure as much of that wealth is retained in communities as possible.
And it's just a general fear and unease on the part of people that are, I remember when we finally passed the law, the governor signed it, we insisted on a very aggressive timeline because I didn't want to be New Jersey, which took 7 years to open the first dispensary. They issued the regulations, and then the RFPs went out, and I think we got 43 applicants for the first 5 licenses. And some of the applicants, they created names using the word marijuana or cannabis in the title. And I remember one of them, they got their money back. If you didn't get a license, you got your the license fee back, less whatever the small application fee was. And the bank would not cash the check. And it was issued from the New York State, Office of the Controller. Tom DiNapoli's name is on it, and they were like, we can't accept this check, it says cannabis on it. I mean, it's just absurd.
Yeah, so there are substantial hurdles,
Yeah.
but when we think about New York as the financial heart of the country, it's really, it's on us to be able to figure it out and to be bold and innovative in finding our solutions. I know you're working on that along with your colleagues, so thank you
Figure
very
it
much.
out, we hope. But thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
All right, let's see who do we have next? So DPA, and then Sarah Payne from Barclay Damon, Barclay Damon. She's our next speaker. She's going to speak on the common legal issues that face marijuana entrepreneurs. Wow, there's a lot of stuff here. Feel free to jump in at any time.
Thank you, Senator Savino. And thank you, and to Senators Krueger and Sanders for hosting this event today. It's a very important conversation to have, given the social issues around cannabis and New York's movement toward further legalization. And for a second, I'd just like to pick up where Melissa and Christina left off, because we as a law firm have tackled some ancillary business issues around having cannabis clients. And those issues have been related to banking. And so what typically we see in the industry is if you are an ancillary business, you are non-plant touching, and you derive something less than a significant percent of your revenue from cannabis services, and the services you're providing to cannabis companies are your normal, ordinary, customary services, usually your banking relationships will not be interfered with. However, the percentage of revenue that constitutes a significant portion is very fuzzy, and there isn't a number tied to it. So for my practice, I lead the cannabis group in a full-service law firm, and our cannabis practice is only one income stream of many, and so we have not had a banking problem. But for a small firm that has a significant cannabis focus, and often we're seeing those types of professional service firms come up, they will face the same banking problems more conventional cannabis companies see. Similarly, with our malpractice insurance, for example, we have to make very robust disclosures about handling cannabis clients.
Really?
And we face often questions from our insurance company about how we deal with client intake, client management, and so forth. So there's couple of important things as licensed professionals, and this will apply to a lot of folks here in Albany as well. And this is a concern I have for so long as cannabis remains a Schedule I substance, or until we get something like the States Act passed. Anybody who has a professional license is in a situation where you are compromising that license as a participant in a criminal enterprise. And so when the state, for example, has state employees, or let's say attorneys or accountants, who are offered to, let's say, a social justice pool of hypothetical licensees on the adult use side, that puts the state and those individuals in a really tough position, because we are allowed to, right now, advise and assist, but not provide business counsel, which is really what a lot of the services are targeted to offer, right?
But isn't your license issued by the state of New York, though?
It is, but that fine line, Senator, is you can advise what the law is, and you can assist in preparing documents, like a lease or transactional documents, but you must stop short of giving business advice, because that does make you an active participant in a criminal enterprise.
Oh, I see.
And so if you are assisting a plant touching business in how do you run your business, how do you work with a bank, how do you get insurance, how do you find real estate, then that's a very serious licensing problem. And that's something that will affect people who are trying to provide business-related services as an adult use program rolls out. And so these federal complications have tentacles in a lot of weird places that we are going to have to address. One of the ways we can address some of this is through ethics opinions for various licensed professionals, but that isn't going to undo the issue of the conflict in federal law. So I think Christine and Melissa did a nice job of talking about the federal issue with the Controlled Substances Act and how everything typically in this space is going to flow from cannabis designation as a Schedule I substance. On the banking side, we have the FinCEN guidance from 2014. Generally speaking, to sort of plug in some of the details from a practical practitioner side, what I have seen in my practice is it is nearly a rite of passage for a cannabis company to have their bank account shut down. And these companies are looking to maintain multiple relationships with multiple institutions because they are counting on sooner or later their bank account will be shut down. Similarly, we have now started to see a lot of consolidation around very large national and multinational enterprises. And one of the FinCEN red flags is money derived from a plant-touching business that flows across state or international lines. And so that's very problematic, of course, when you have a company that holds licenses in more than one state and has a headquarters. Or maybe it's publicly listed in Canada, and now it's going to take the money it's raised in Canada and grow its business in the United States. So I'm seeing in my practice a lot of companies address this through cryptocurrency. and converting their revenue generated in one state into cryptocurrency for the purpose of moving it to another state or to wherever their headquarter bank account is located, often in offshore somewhere. And it strikes me as counterproductive for an industry where we're so worried about bad drug behavior and money laundering, and are we going to collect the tax revenue that is the purpose often behind our very regimented licensing structures, that we don't have a better system to service these enterprises. So I'm concerned from a practitioner perspective that the longer it takes us to develop these solutions, the more time a solution like cryptocurrency is going to have to entrench itself.
Right.
And we are going to lose that opportunity to have our revenue from cannabis companies be transparent and to normalize the industry like it needs to be normalized in order to function like an ordinary business. And so I think, you know, your work and the work of a number of other legislators has been very important. And I do think that New York has a great opportunity to be a leader in this space. And going forward, to the extent that, you know, we can make that a priority, I think it's really critical because I see it in my practice as a big pain point on an almost daily basis. And one example I'd like to use is around industrial hemp. So I see a lot of industrial hemp clients in my practice. At the end of 2018, we saw industrial hemp expressly removed from the definition of marijuana for Controlled Substance Act purposes. Financial institutions are still hesitant to do business with industrial hemp companies.
Why?
Great question. There, to a large extent, it's an education factor, but those services are incredibly slow to come online. And so even once we present a solution, it's not going to be overnight. It's going to take some time. And especially for larger financial institutions, those that are nationally chartered, it's going to, I think, be a hard sell because they're risk adverse, because the anti-money laundering program for compliance has been so regimented for such a long period of time. It's not going to be an overnight solution, even if, for example, marijuana was rescheduled. One of the things that you mentioned earlier that I think is worth discussing here today is the tax situation. As you
280E issue.
yeah, as you pointed out earlier this morning, marijuana companies are subject to a provision of the tax law called 280E. 280E disallows business deductions for these companies. So what the rough translation of that is these companies often are saddled with an effective tax rate of 72 to 76%, which is really, really crushing. So when you couple that with not really being able to put your money anywhere, and when you put your cash in your safe with your product, and one of the FinCEN red flags is cash that smells like marijuana is grounds to shut your account down, you know, you're just sort of begging to discourage people to come out of the black market into the licensed market. And that, I think, to me, is one of the biggest risks of designing an adult use program really well, is other states have not done it in a great way. So we have actually seen a lot of growth in the black market. So we've seen really high tax rates.
Right.
And you couple that with the 280E issue at the federal level. All sorts of states, including New York, follow the IRS model at the state level. So you've got the state income tax issue that has the same 280E impact, and then you have the marijuana tax on top of that. There's really not a lot of incentive for small operations to go through the licensing process. And I think there's, this ties into the social justice component in a very important way, because there's a lot of folks who are currently generating their family's income from illicit drug sales around marijuana. Mm-hmm. And the only way you don't have a black market, right, is to either get it right or to have an enormous crackdown, which I don't think anybody wants to see. Mm-hmm. And so the goal has to be incentivizing people to come out of the black market and to fully participate in the regulated market. And when that's really difficult and expensive,
And there's no profit in it.
and there is no profit, in fact, it could end up costing you money, and it takes away the income, illegal as it may be, that folks have been using to support their families, then one, they're not going to come out of the black market, and two, I think we have a very real risk that we are going to incentivize other drugs.
Right.
And we can't do that. So,
You raised some very important points, and again, it's an extraordinary difficult industry to stay in, not just to get in, but to stay in. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people because they think of they read the top lines of the amount of revenue that's been produced in some other states. It didn't start there. It takes a while to build out, and that's why I cautioned a lot of my colleagues, don't start counting the money before we have opened up a single dispensary or a single license has been issued. It takes a while to do it, and the fact that you can't use Colorado or California as the standard, because by the time New York finally does get rolling, you're going to have other states around us. Maybe New Jersey goes first, maybe it doesn't, I don't really know. They have the same reticence on the part of their legislators that we seem to have in ours. But you're going to have other states around us that already have a legal market that's going to cut down on whatever revenue New York State produces. If you overtax it and you dedicate the money to all sorts of other things, you run the risk that, one, you will not realize the tax, it's not going to come through. The illegal market is not going to go away. And again, if I'm operating in the underground economy now, why would I want to come forward and subject myself to the scrutiny of the federal government and the regulatory structure of the state government for the little bit of money that I may actually make in an incredibly complex environment like this? And I wasn't even thinking about the issues of the ancillary business and the risks that they face.
yeah. Those are really significant. So one of the things that I often wonder is the state collects licensing fees right now,
Right.
for example, from our existing medical companies. Where does that money go? Mm-hmm. Because now the state is effectively...
Well, we haven't collected that much, right? There's only 10 license holders in the state.
But still...
So it was $200,000 a license less I think it was $10,000 application
Yep.
fee.
But still, by handling that money, the state is a RICO participant.
I'm sure the governor will be happy to hear that.
Is a technical matter, right? But, I mean, that's the type of silliness that we confront. And for very conservative industries, and I see this a lot with CPAs particularly, it's a hard sell to bring the type of professional expertise on board to provide services that are much, much needed in this complicated space, particularly for folks who do not have a lot of business and entrepreneurial experience.
I spoke at the CPA's, the State Association or whatever their organization is, last year, I think it was, no, the year before. And they're very interested in how do you service this client? Because again, I think all of what you would call the ancillary businesses want some direction. How do I service my client if I want to be attorneys for? And I think that's one of the reasons why vertical integration seem to make sense for some entities, because if I need a lawyer, they're part of the, you know, registered organization. I have my in-house lawyer, I have my own accountant, I don't have to worry about those things. But all of those things drive up the cost, and it makes it harder and harder for people to gain access to the industry.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have any questions? You were a CPA, aren't you? Would be very complicated to service one of these clients, wouldn't it?
Clearly.
So one of the few ways, and back to the tax issue for a moment, one of the few ways that these companies have to push their tax liability down is to design a corporate structure that maximizes their cost of goods. And this isn't overly effective in a vertically integrated company, right? Because right now in our New York medical marijuana program, we have constraints around our licensees that prevent anybody but the licensee from performing the licensed activity. So those companies are prevented from taking some industry standard measures to push that tax liability down even a little bit. To the extent that we're looking at an adult use program that removes the vertical integration barrier, the other problem is the corporate structure around increasing the cost of goods sold is really most effective in the cultivation and processing levels, and not as effective at the dispensary level, which unfortunately is the level that is most affordable for mom and pop startups to enter. And so that's the level where tax relief is needed the most, and the area where there's the least amount of opportunity to do anything about it. So you mean
the cost of goods?
That's right, I'm sorry.
Although, I'm assuming, I've been to other states, I've seen the dispensaries, and some of them are pretty elaborate now. I think out in Nevada, we visited one project, Planet 13. It's the largest dispensary in the country. It's like a mall. So I'm sure they spent a fortune on that one. But even under our program, the requirements for a dispensary, and I think it would exist in the adult use program too, the physical plant requirements, the installation of a vault, are extraordinarily expensive.
Very expensive.
Yeah, so I mean, those, assuming we could get beyond the 280E issue, or that would be something that they would be able to at least get some relief from if we could solve the tax problem.
Maybe. I think you open up a lot of other problems, right? So those are very expensive things. So if we are going to require the same type of physical infrastructure, then we also have to think about how are we going to create pools of capital that don't jeopardize any third party's license, accreditation, career otherwise, and that is actually an existing pot of money. And I do wonder, we've seen some very ineffective social justice programs roll out in other states, and I have ongoing concern that often it's politically expedient to talk about social justice, but when you look at it on the ground, if we give a group of people who have been really harmed by criminalization, let's say, for example, a licensing preference or a head start in the industry, that maybe that's a little bit disingenuous because there are such problems with the business infrastructure and the capital requirements and the access to all of these things that are necessary for a company to operate, that in a lot of ways we're setting folks up for failure. And that perhaps there are more effective ways around education in the industry and employment opportunities and automatic expungement and apprenticeship and encouraging larger companies that do have the capital to participate to become ESOPs and have
What's an ESOP?
employee-owned
Oh.
companies. So instead of bearing the burden and the complexity of having to be a sole proprietor, that folks who have been harmed by criminalization could become a shareholder in an entity that has the capital and the capacity to meaningfully participate and expect to be successful. Instead of, for example, get a head start, but then have to contract out to one of those companies
Right.
management services.
Right. I've seen a couple of interesting models. I know I met with a group from California called the People's Dispensary. It's like a cooperative model. I met with a gentleman from LA who was actually in the fast food industry. He's not in the cannabis industry, but he became an investor in the cannabis industry, creating almost like I want to say a cooperative model again, how to help finance, but more importantly, how to help people develop the skill set so that you could not just get into the business, but stay in the business.
Right.
And that's another thing. I think that if New York is really going to lead on this issue, we also need to recognize that this is not just, it's a growing industry, no pun intended, right?
Right.
And it's also a new workforce that we should be training, I know we like to call them bud tenders, but there's really a science to this. Many people, particularly in states that have adult use now, where you had medical first and now you have adult use, not everyone wants to be a medical patient. They don't want to go through the scrutiny of talking to their doctor. They use marijuana now because they know it makes them feel better. They don't know why, but it makes them feel better, so they self-medicate. So there's almost a wellness component too, and there's a place for that in the adult use market. But you need people who have an understanding of the plant and how it works for people. It doesn't necessarily have to be the medical model, but I think we need to create more educational opportunities in our university system and create a
Yes.
career path for people as well.
That's an excellent point, with which I wholeheartedly agree. And we're right back to the money issue and the Schedule I
Right.
issue, right? Because all universities, to some extent, are the beneficiary of federal funding or subject to federal regulations.
But if they don't touch the plant, if they're just teaching about cannabis management or cannabis, the effect on, the human system, that probably shouldn't run afoul of any federal rules.
I think you're right. I think that there is some non-plant touching opportunity to not jeopardize federal funding. But for schools who want to teach a bud tender, for example, or get into the science of genetics, and really have a more robust offering that deals more on the science and botany side, I think
Right.
that's going to be problematic.
Possibly.
But I guess the point I would like to leave everyone with is there are some real opportunities I see around social justice and making a very meaningful impact for folks and for communities who have been disproportionately affected by criminalization. And I think that we've left out some really important populations from how we're defining our social justice pool. I think women is a really, really critical group to put emphasis on, because often, even though we're seeing the very high incarceration rates of Black and Latino men, it is often women who are left with the family dysfunction resulting from losing men to incarceration. We have left out veterans entirely who suffer disproportionately from PTSD, for example, and who have wildly disproportionate levels of drug use and absolutely astonishing rate of suicide. And this is an opportunity to not only give them a skill set and an opportunity to have a new career and reintegrate to civilian society, but to address some of those past demons. And so I think the legislature should consider adding veterans into that group, and
As a preferred subgroup for licensing?
yes,
Okay.
yes. And not discount the harm that women have suffered as a result of criminalization, because they may not be the disproportionately incarcerated pool, but they do have a huge community burden of criminalization. The other thing that I think would be very valuable to New York is, as we continue down an adult use path and expanding our cannabis program, is to consider a residency requirement.
Well, I think we already have that in the medical. You have to be a resident of the state of New York. You have to be an entity. All that means is you have to have a New York State presence. So you could be a national organization with a New York State presence.
Right.
You're suggesting that it should solely be a New York State?
I don't know if solely, but I think.
I think that's unconstitutional. I don't think we could do that.
No, I don't think we could do that, but I think we do need to make sure that the footprint and the commitment to the state is really meaningful, instead of, letting a lot of outsiders swoop in and take opportunity away from legitimate New York businesses.
That opens up an interesting discussion. I don't think any of us will ever really understand the selection process or the scoring mechanism that was used on the licenses that were issued for the medical program. To this day, I don't understand it. Like the first, again, 43 people applied, or 43 entities applied, some of whom were operational in other places that had a real understanding of how to, run a medical program. Most of the ones who had the most experience didn't get a license, and some of them that had no experience did. So there was no rhyme or reason to it, and I think if we do an adult use program, there will be more thought that goes into the scoring mechanism on the adult use side. And again, the vision for the adult use licensing would be a 3-tier system. So you have cultivation, processing, distribution, dispensary. It's a somewhat different model. But I do agree with you that we want to give preferences to New Yorkers at different levels. There's always been this discussion of whether you can require an MWBE component or a veterans component on a license. You can do that on a state contract,
Right.
but on a license, it's a little bit different. I
Yes.
think you have to,
There are
the
some
language has to be different.
serious
Otherwise,
constitutional
yes, there's
issues.
serious constitutional issues on that. So it would
That's
have to be
right.
preference or additional points for
Right.
specific, issues that you would meet on this license application. But all, valid points of how we need to try and grow this industry. I can't say that often enough, grow the industry.
Yeah, and always no pun intended, but it does really go back to business infrastructure over and over and over again, and how do we give people the tools to be successful? And the financial component is an enormous hurdle.
Right.
And what the ideal answer is, I don't know, but we do have an opportunity in New York to put careful thought into that. I don't think we're going to be able to solve with perfection all of the issues until we have some movement federally. I am concerned that on the federal level, we're not going to get meaningful votes. I think we'll probably see the Safe Banking Act get through the House. I don't know as we'll see it get a vote in the Senate.
It's absurd.
It is absurd. But I think that's where we're at, and I think we're gonna be stuck here for a while.
And the problem for that is, so again, you have state after state after state that's adopting cannabis laws and then creating their own regulatory structure and creating and issuing licenses and you are building, cultivation centers everywhere, and at some point, you're gonna have 50 states and 50 different sets of regulations and 50 different, systems, and it makes no sense. So you look at Oregon. Oregon issued licenses, they issued too many licenses, right? And so if you were an early investor and you got in, you are now on the verge of bankruptcy. Because you invested everything, there's way too much product, it's flooding the black market, and it's, now, if New York, if they would just pass the Marijuana States Act, we could actually buy product from Oregon today.
Right.
And we wouldn't have to go through this whole process of creating a regulatory structure in New York. We could open dispensaries.
Yep.
We could create a New York market if we wanted to, but we wouldn't have to. But so by the time we finally get some relief from the federal government, we're gonna have 50 different ways
Right.
to cultivate marijuana, and 50 different sets of rules and regulations, and then have a federal overlay.
Right.
I'm gonna start smoking pot then. Well, I really want to thank you for your input. It's been somewhat eye-opening. Do you have any questions, Senator Felder? You're very
Thank you.
quiet over there.
I'm listening.
I know, you always do. Timothy Strong from the Visions Federal Credit Union, Nikki Cateman from RWDSU, and Hillary Peckham, who is the COO of Etain Health Medical Marijuana. And Michael Cooper from where he's a co-founder and managing member of Madison J Solutions, and vice chair of the National Cannabis Industry Association State Regulations Committee. And he also serves as a member of the NCIA Policy Council.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Hillary Peckham, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Etain, which is the only family-owned and the only women-owned medical cannabis licensee in the state of New York. We were one of the original 5 licensees, and I think at this point, we're the only ones that have maintained our structure throughout the application to present day. So what I wanted to speak about was just boots on the ground, like how the current finance struggles of cannabis companies affect me and my company on a day-to-day basis. And the first thing is just personally, it can jeopardize your own assets or anything like that. So just in January, I was denied a mortgage because I own a cannabis company. And that was from 3 banks, and I finally found one that would accept me. Now, I have collateral, like I am in a different position. I'm also an owner of our other family company. And these are from banks that, my family has had a 50-year relationship with. So as far as the FinCEN guidelines of know your client, they know everything about me since before I was born, everything about my family, and I still couldn't get a mortgage. And so if I'm put in this position, I can only imagine what somebody else who already might have struggled getting a bank account because they come from a much more difficult situation, like a social justice applicant. What are they going to do in their personal lives? And it can jeopardize existing mortgages. I've heard of that too. And then it can also jeopardize any other assets you hold. So when we first got we were going to our first planning session in Chestertown, New York, and an article came out that misrepresented what Etain was. And it said, it's a subsidiary of the other business. And it was completely independent. We had just incorporated, or we hadn't even. Within an hour, every bank that that company uses called the CEO and said, basically, we'll shut down your entire construction company tomorrow.
Which bank was that?
It was Chase, TD, Key, and there was one other. So it can jeopardize everything that you have, especially if it's connected and any financing is connected. So just on a personal level, it can be very difficult. From an employment perspective, it's also difficult. These are challenges that employees will face as well. And oftentimes you find in California, I hear all the time that they're creating shell companies that can just process payroll. And so they try to find tricky solutions, but the legality is unclear of that even, but it's a way that you can pay your employees and provide them benefits. Today, we do have a payroll service, but that is unique. we cannot find, or there's very limited options for 401ks. And so those are just sort of some of the day-to-day operational issues. Then you get to you get a license, what do you do? Once you get a license for anybody, getting access to capital or like venture capital is not that difficult. The issue is that it comes at a cost. And so what wasn't described before is yes, you see a lot of these public companies raising $100, $200, $500 million, but the average interest rate of the loans in cannabis right now are above 10%. So you almost can't pay them off. I know the average loan, our accounting firm that represents a lot of different cannabis companies, they were saying the average that they're seeing right now is 12 to 14% interest rates for when you raise money. So either you're going to have that interest rate or it's going to come at an equity stake. And so I know for me personally, you see with women, they don't get the same proportion of venture capital money that male-owned companies do, so that's one hurdle. But then also they'll try and ask for a very large equity stake. So generally, the equity stake would be so big that then I cease to be a WBE, which is also a risk. The issues with banking are that you can't really get a line of credit or a loan from almost all banks. I only know of one that's considering it at this point. So you're not going to find the traditional funding options. But then even exacerbated is, I think that, and needs to be considered, is funding options through New York State. I think there's some compliance going on with accepting cannabis money because you have been now for many, many years.
How do you guys pay New York State? How do you convey your tax revenue?
We have a bank account, and we use checks, but I think at least half, if not more, of the cannabis companies in New York State currently have been kicked out of a bank, ourselves included, and then you have to scramble and try and find another alternative. We had the same thing where we were okay, we had a bank account until we actually started sales, and then that triggered extra compliance from the bank that we were with, and we got kicked out.
How do you handle sales from patients?
What do you mean?
Do they pay cash or?
Yeah, so we can't accept insurance, and credit card options are they also come with a very high interest rate, so they'll take 7 to 12% of your purchase. So there are credit options, but they're kind of extortion and very limited too, so we don't take those. So debit processing is okay. We do have a debit processor, but usually it's cash. That means that patients are paying up front for their medication.
I saw an interesting model in one dispensary in Nevada where they sell gift cards. So you buy a gift card, and then you use the gift card to purchase the product. And I think it's a much cheaper way. It's a lower, so like you buy an American Express gift card or whatever it is.
Yep.
The fee is much lower, and then you turn around and use the gift card to buy the product.
It can be that way, but that's sort of a way of deceiving the credit processing machine, so it's not totally truthful. When we actually pay our excise tax every month or everything, so there's got to be some guideline, some protocols for accepting cannabis money going on somewhere in one of the government offices. However, we were denied a JDA loan just this past year because the office there didn't feel fully equipped to be able to handle the compliance related to accepting cannabis money.
What's a JDA loan?
It was a Job Development Authority loan through Economic State Development.
So ESDC
Yep.
would not grant you a loan,
Nope, they said we were a good candidate, but that they didn't feel that they could handle the compliance related to accepting cannabis money at this time. Now, we've never had an issue depositing our excise tax or our licensing fees with New York State, but this loan was apparently too big a threshold for this department. So I think that some consideration needs to be made towards giving them and empowering those people to be able to accept and grant these loans, because that would be, to me, the best way of giving access to capital to people like women, minorities, social justice applicants, with a much lower interest rate than you're going to see from the standard venture capital market, and that you're not going to get from a bank. And so that is something that I think should be a big priority, is figuring out, you already have these programs, how can you leverage them to help people who are trying to get into the cannabis business? The other aspect of this is ongoing. 280E at a state level should be abolished. Right now, the state is following the federal protocol, so we pay 280E both at the state and federal level, even though this is legal at the state level. And so it would have represented like about a 7% savings
Right.
for us, which could be enormous, and quite honestly is directly translated to patient expense right now. I do think with vertical companies, you're better able to increase your cost of goods sold. But where that comes to sort of bite you in the butt is it winds up that if you put everything into cost of goods sold, your inventory, the value of your existing inventory goes way up. So then if you have any surplus at the end of the year, that's valued really high, and you're going to pay a lot of tax on that. So there's no incentive to have surplus, but we have a regulatory obligation to maintain a year's
Right.
supply of products. So surplus has to be there. So we're kind of already negating the benefits of cost of goods sold. So it's kind of a difficult aspect to manage. So 280E at the state level, I think, would be enormously helpful. And then finally, ancillary stuff like buying greenhouses, accounting firms, those are all things that we've personally been impacted by. Our accounting firm kicked us out, so we had to go find another one. Just if you're going to purchase a greenhouse, most of them will ask for that money up front. So that makes it even more expensive. So
Right.
before we even have it and we know that it can be put together and all the measurements are okay, normally you'd hold back 30% or something like that. All of it has to be out the door before you even receive the shipment. So there's a lot of different aspects of this business that just cost more because you don't get lines of credit, you don't get sort of the trust that you would get if it were any kind of other business.
Thank you, Hillary. So we're going to move on to Nikki Cateman.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate Senator Sanders, Senator Savino, and Senator Krueger for putting together this panel. So as was stated, I'm Nikki Cateman. I am the Political and Communications Director of Local 338 RWDSU UFCW. We represent several hundred workers in the New York's medical cannabis industry. So we kind of provide a very unique perspective on banking in this industry. So first and foremost, this is a worker issue purely on a safety issue. This is a cash industry. Our members are the ones who are handling the cash coming in. They're the ones who are transporting cash to and from in between facilities. So obviously this is a significant worker safety issue. The ROs do an incredible job of ensuring safety protocols. Part of this is state mandated, but some of it is also just ensuring there are protections in place for assets as well as the workers. So for us, this is a huge issue. Banking solutions important because it means less opportunities for safety issues to happen for workers who are handling this issue. On the union side, we have collectively bargained contracts, and one of the pillars of our negotiations is retirement and securing a retirement benefit for the workers we represent. And we, unfortunately, were advised by our attorneys that we cannot have these workers in our pension or annuity funds. We would be subject for a RICO suit and jeopardizing all of our assets in our pension and annuity funds, which is quite terrifying. So we have tried to find alternate solutions. We've met with credit unions, we've met with the labor bank, we've met with some investment firms who we'll have great meetings, great conversations, and we'll get to the final point of maybe putting pen to paper and developing a plan, and it triggers something on their end, and unfortunately it falls apart. So what we have done instead is to make sure that there is a provision for a retirement benefit, is we've negotiated basically the workers get a stipend, what the employer would have been contributing to our pension or annuity fund. That goes to the worker with the hope that they'll be able to invest in a 401k. As Hillary mentioned, unfortunately, our members often, that's become a significant hurdle. Many banks are very nervous about it, and this includes many of our members who are working in this industry come from other industries where they've already had a 401k established, and they're having a really hard time finding a financial institution which will allow them to roll over that 401k that's already existing, it's already set up, there's money sitting there. So they're having a hard time, and we pride ourselves in trying to provide services for our members, and this is one of the ones where we're totally stumped. Our attorneys are stumped. We can't force a financial institution to take their money as much as they probably want to take it. They just are legally bound from taking it. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. The other pieces of this is, Hillary also mentioned, most of the companies do have found payroll mechanisms. So they're getting pay stubs, so filing their taxes is not an issue. In other states where there aren't as many solutions, or smaller businesses haven't found payroll companies that they're able to work with, workers are being paid in cash, which creates a logistical nightmare come tax season. We haven't had this happen yet to our members, but we know it's happening. The United Food and Commercial Workers represents workers in this industry in other states. We've heard that their members there have had problems getting loans, student loans, personal loans, and while it hasn't happened to our members yet, we wouldn't be surprised if it happens soon. And then, of course, the other thing is the ancillary impact. The success of a business is the success of the worker, especially in a facility that's unionized. We recognize when a company does well, the workers do well, or that's the intent. And looking ahead, obviously, we expect and we hope that there will be small businesses and MWBEs, and if there's not capital there to help businesses grow and thrive and expand and develop their business models, that will not trickle down to the worker there. It'll hinder the worker. So there are a lot of solutions, and we can identify a lot of the problems, but the workers are an important voice in this conversation because they're also directly impacted, and they're relying on what happens to the businesses regardless of what size they are.
So I have a question, Nikki. Because we require under the medical statute, and it would extend through to the adult use bill, labor peace agreements. Does it require collective bargaining, but it just says, a condition of your license is that you can't oppose it.
Right.
So you have negotiated some contracts, you represent some of the ROs, but because it's a private sector entity, that's governed by federal National Labor Relations Board. How do you hold a union election for an industry that, under federal rules, that the federal government says is illegal?
So where we have successfully negotiated contracts, it was through the neutrality agreements and card check recognition. So we've gotten the required amount of sign-ons, union authorization cards, which is 50% plus one. We like to have more than that, but then it becomes we have a conversation with the company, and we've been very fortunate so far that the companies we've worked with have recognized their workers' desire to join a union. So we haven't had to go to a traditional union election yet. That's happened in other states, and there've been, it's worked out fine because the state gets involved. But in New York, we've been very fortunate where we've been able to have just card check recognition.
But in those states where it has gone to a union election, how did the NLRB, how did they deal with it?
I actually don't know the full specifics. I know it's happened. I'm happy to find out and get back to you, but I'm New York centric, so I'm happy to find out. I don't know what's happened, but I know it's happened.
It never occurred to me until just this moment, so don't feel bad. I should know the answer to that question myself since I included it in the legislation.
I probably should as well.
Thinking about it now.
Our next speaker, I'm glad to be back. I did a committee hearing and I'm back, and the issue of marijuana and banking came up there too. Please,
Thank
if you'll
you.
identify yourself also.
Sure.
So, Mike.
I'm Michael Cooper. I'm the managing member of Madison J Solutions, and we are compliance consultants. We basically help companies, particularly in the states that have adult use businesses, help them put in place best practices, help them run their compliance operation in the way that a normal, highly regulated company would run their business. And I'm also a New Yorker, so this is much less travel than I often have to do. So I'm honored to be here, and I really appreciate the senators who convened this to try to get this right, because that's something that you see lots of different models across the country, and trying to get this right is really important, because there are, as I believe Senator Savino mentioned, there are a lot of ways to get this wrong and some ways to get this right. So as a New Yorker and someone involved in this industry, I very much appreciate that you're taking the time to do this. What I was asked to speak about is the actual effect of banking on compliance and regulation, and sort of highlight how important that can be. So one thing is it has a very real impact on the state market itself. If you're worried about regulatory control over these businesses, banking is an important part of that. Now, that's true in any industry. The less cash you have in a business, there's more transparency. Cash is easier to do things in untraceable ways with. So when I used to design compliance programs for big businesses, one of the first things that we would look at is cash management, how much money was sitting in petty cash. Because if things happen through bank accounts, there are records. You can see who withdrew the money, who signed off on it, what was the business purpose that was listed. You can't just write a check, sign your name to it, and not expect there to be questions after the fact. And one might think, if you've never done this, that the business purposes can be generic and it wouldn't tell you that much, but I can tell you I have conducted investigations in my past life tracking back that very question, because someone writes something and you can ask that person what that meant, and you can look for patterns, because with bank records it's all there, it's all clear when this happened, what the purpose was, what the timing was. You don't have that if money is being kept in a safe or a vault. A safe or a vault doesn't tell you who pulled it out. You may have ledger, but you don't have line item specificity, and you can't look for patterns in the same way as you can looking at bank records. So banking has a very significant impact in a positive way on putting in place controls that are effective for a highly regulated industry, which is why I'm always amazed. If you want to get this right, this type of industry, banking is a huge asset. I think that what you often also see, because I've been speaking about that retrospectively, looking back in time, it also has a proactive benefit. For the person who is signing off on the expense or pulling the money out for whatever reason, if there's a question in their mind, is this something that I was supposed to be doing? If they know that there's a bank record, if they know they're the one signing, they're going to escalate that up the food chain. So if you're concerned about a rogue actor within one of these organizations, which is obviously something that policymakers are often concerned about, there's more checks in place there. Now, this also matters to companies. It's safer for the companies at a very basic level. If you're a business, you don't want criminals to think you have a big pile of cash sitting somewhere on your premises. It's just not a good thing. And you saw that particularly at the beginning of legalization. There were some scary sounding crimes, and I think a lot of that has gone away because there's more banking in the industry now, and there's also better safeguards, and a lot of state rules will have specific requirements for how you keep money, the types of safes and locks to use, things like that. It's also, and this is something that I think you've heard a lot about today, it's much easier to access service providers and high-quality service providers if you have a bank account. Your accountant, putting aside everything else that's been discussed, your accountant doesn't want to be paid in cash. Your accountant doesn't have the security infrastructure to keep that cash, and your accountant probably doesn't want to go to their bank with this pile of cash and say, this is where it came from, because that's a sort of different, that's a different set of questions. Now, that extends broadly. We're talking about accountants. Your landlord probably doesn't want cash. Every service provider who you could think of if they're not a licensed business, probably doesn't want cash. The licensed businesses probably don't want cash either, but your landlord, your accountant, your lawyer, these people don't want your cash. They want to be paid like they are in the normal course. And if you do find someone who's willing to take your cash, they may well want a premium. And look, that's another real cost for these businesses. I should also mention that this matters a lot to employees. Employees want to be paid not in cash. You've heard my fellow panelists talk about the challenges for people and for companies administering it, but just at a simple level, you want your money in the bank. That's where it's safest. Most employees, particularly the type of sophisticated workers that are involved in this, you see people like a lab director. Imagine trying to get a PhD lab director and telling them, okay, we're going to pay you in cash every 2 weeks, and you're going to drive this home to your family. Would you want to be that lab director, or would you stay doing your PhD work wherever you're doing it now? There's sort of a differential. It's also something that I think a lot of them probably think about. They don't want to go to work where criminals might think there's a big pile of money. We talked about that as a benefit to the company, but it's also a benefit to the employee. Just for your peace of mind, it's not a bank. You don't want to think you're going to work at the place where criminals think all the money is sitting. And so that, I think, has a real benefit that feeds back on the market. It's a virtuous cycle, because if employees are happy, if they feel safe, if you have the best people, that's going to lead to a better regulated market and lead to a safer market overall. One of the other things that I was asked to talk about is the impact of banking and these types of measures from the perspective of federal regulators and the potential for federal intervention. One thing that I always bring up with clients is that where states and markets have been threatened with federal intervention, it's generally been because there's a suggestion that things are out of control there, or it's too loosely regulated. You've heard, and obviously you're familiar with the Cole memo. The actual human James Cole, for whom the memo is named, said in 2014, and I often bring this up, told California, quote, if you don't want us prosecuting marijuana users in your state, then get your regulatory act together. Basically, the view was California had a lighter touch regulatory regime at the time, and the federal government wanted to make it clear that that wasn't going to fly. There needed to be tighter controls on the market. And so today, California has a much more robust regulatory system than it did in 2014. And I don't know that those two things are wholly unrelated. So how to prevent federal intervention, whether at the state level or the company level, is something that people in the industry think about a lot. And as a background matter, it is worth remembering, these are very popular programs. It tends to poll over 60%. It's not something that someone is going to wake up in the morning in one of these states and say, how do I shut down this popular market? They're generally going to be looking for bad actors or things that they're concerned are out of control.
But the environment almost puts people who are good actors at risk all the time,
Yes.
for no reason, for no reason whatsoever.
Yes, Senator. That is 100% true, and it's one of the things that is most concerning about this, that if you step back and you said, okay, clearly voters want this, the public wants this, lawmakers want this, you still have a number of additional hurdles that put people at real risk, like having a pile of money sitting in your business. That puts people at real risk, and I'm not sure why. I don't think it makes sense from a common sense perspective. Even if you're against having one of these markets, why you would want this pool of cash to be sitting out there, I don't know. One of the things that you heard about the Cole memo being rescinded, and the new Attorney General Barr, has, in his confirmation, seemed to suggest that a policy of non-intervention might be back on the table. That said, throughout this process, when it was put in place, when it was rescinded, I think that a lot of those principles of what the federal government cares about still hold true. And a number of them are implicated by banking. So if you look at some of those factors, one factor is preventing revenues from sales from getting to criminal gangs, enterprises, cartels. Banks are very important in knowing with greater certainty that that's not happening. The money goes into the bank. It's not so easy to then get it into the illicit market. And this is not my area of expertise, but I imagine that drug cartels don't want to be paid by check. I don't know. I don't know anyone.
They don't want
in
to pay
the drug-
taxes either.
They don't want to pay taxes, and they don't want you to issue them a 1099 at the end of the year. But if you have money going out of your organization to a vendor or whatever it is that you would set this up as a cutout or a straw man, you should be issuing a 1099. And if there's a bank record showing that transaction, your accountant is going to see it and go, okay, I saw this payment, who's that to? I don't know what happens if you try to 1099 a drug cartel, but I imagine it's not a good thing. So I imagine people just don't do it.
They make movies about that.
One other thing is that once the money's in a bank, you can see patterns. So even in that, stepping back from that somewhat silly example of 1099ing a cartel, you can see patterns, and you can look to see, is money flowing in a way that it doesn't seem like it should be based on how the company is set up? Is somebody drawing a profit share who wasn't supposed to be? That's the advantage of bank records, because once you go looking for it, you can see it. And it also permits regulators, auditors, investors, whoever it is, to look at what's happening with the money and then say, okay, if this is happening in one place, is it happening in other companies? You often see sweeps because someone sees a bad act taken in one place and they look to see, is it happening in other places? So bank records play a very important role there. Another priority that the federal government identified is preventing diversion. That is to say, product from one legal market winding up in another. Obviously, tightly tracking product is a good way to prevent that from happening, but you also want to look at, are there below market transactions? Are there above market transactions? Suspicious transactions occurring in a pattern that you would see from bank records. So again, I think that those are very important. And one other that I'll mention is preventing violence and the use of firearms in connection with the cultivation and distribution of the product. If you no longer have pools of cash sitting around in these businesses, you make them significantly safer and you take away a lot of the risk that there's going to be violent crime that they're the victims of, not the perpetrators of, but that still is relevant to the federal government. Is there a lot of violent crime happening around the industry? If you take the cash out of it, there's going to be less. And I think that raises a point which I would urge the Senate and policymakers to consider, which is there's a sort of counterintuitive point where you don't want to place too much regulation on the market, because at the end of the day, you want it to be competitive. You want people to look at the illicit market, which unfortunately exists, and say, no, I would rather go to this regulated dispensary because the product's going to be safer. I'd like to go because there's a union workforce and I want to support them. There's any number of good reasons why you can convince people to do this, but it's both avoiding setting the tax rate too high that it's prohibitive for people, and also permitting these organizations to explain those benefits, permitting whoever administers the program to let people know these are the benefits of buying from a regulated market instead of whatever you might get from the unregulated market.
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the decisions that was made in our medical program by the department is that they're not allowed to advertise at all. They can't even have a sign that looks attractive, which is just ridiculous. But I think that's something we need to change. You know, for patients who still don't know enough about the product, if their doctors aren't participatory, I think the state's website is a little too wonky when you go online to see it. But, you know, if you're Etain and you want to be able to, you know, buy some advertising space somewhere, or you want to go to a public health fair, and give out information.
But do also keep in mind that even if there is advertising, that is not a deductible expense.
No, I
So
understand that.
Spending a ton of money on
But I mean,
advertising.
even in an effort to draw people to you, to let them
Yeah.
know about your dispensaries and your product and how it could benefit them, you're not allowed to do that.
No,
It just
I
makes
also
no
think
sense.
that in concert with that, there should be, I think, more of an educational program from like the Department of Health to educate people on why they should be using this rather than going to an illicit provider and the benefits that it already has. And I haven't seen a campaign like that that demonstrates particularly the high quality and safety of the products that we're
Right.
doing right now.
Well, if they won't let you advertise, I can't imagine they think they can advertise. But I think we need to change that in the regulations.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I'm sorry, Senator Sanders.
Oh, no, I was, have you finished, sir?
I was going to make one more point.
Please.
The one other point which I was asked to raise or discuss is what is the status of banking across the country? And what I can tell you is that the more mature a market is, the more banking services that tend to be available. What you often see are one or two entities that decide to make the leap and believe that they can do this in accordance with the FinCEN guidance and their applicable internal procedures and regulatory procedures. And then when bad things seem not to happen to them, you often see more come in. In my judgment, it's often a function of the market size. So when you have states adopting adult use, that often increases the market size. There are many more operators in play, which creates more potential market share for the banks or the credit unions to look at, and that sometimes incentivizes more folks to come in. But ultimately, the ones who come in at the beginning are going to charge, as you mentioned earlier, very significant fees because they're trying to get a handle on doing everything in the best way possible, and there are no economies of scale. They're doing it one-off for that first client who they take in. As the markets mature, you then do start to see those fees come down. So my understanding is that banking fees are lower in the Northwest or Colorado than they would be in, say, Massachusetts. But that takes time, and it takes market size, and as with everything else, the bigger the market, the more likely you are to get higher quality service providers who are competing on price, whether it's banks, whether it's accountants. There are people who learn how to do this, who then come into the market. So I think that that is one important consideration. It takes time and it takes market size to really bring these service providers in.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker.
Thank you again. So my name is Tim Strong, and I'm the Community Development Manager for Visions Federal Credit Union. We're headquartered in Broome County, and we have 51 branches across 3 states right now, currently New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. So a fairly large footprint as far as credit unions go. And we appreciate the invitation here to address the concerns with this industry. The expansion, and I think it's going to echo what a lot of the other panelists are saying, and I appreciate them kind of sharing these because it does back up some of the examples we're going to share. The expansion of the industry has left a gap in banking services, and you know, the goal is really to educate on what roadblocks exist, and then really talk about what needs to be done to help limit liability for not only consumers and the businesses, but then also for the financial institutions as well. I also just will state too, the comments of Visions here, our opinion only, and should not be considered operating practices, as Visions currently does not engage in any depository or lending services to the industry. So I think that's important, and it echoes pretty much what everyone else has stated. The first question was that we were prefaced with ahead of time was based on the climate in Washington. What are some minimal expectations you would need to see at the federal level to do business with cannabis companies and workers? Just a quick overview on credit unions in general. So credit unions are not-for-profit financial cooperatives founded around the philosophy of people helping people. Part of this philosophy is our dedication to supporting small and women and minority-owned businesses. We do serve a lot of markets that the larger businesses, larger banks tend to, I want to say ignore, but not serve as well. But we do need to be able to support our members safely. Obviously, at the federal level, marijuana remains illegal, Schedule I drug, And that creates obviously an issue for us being a federally chartered financial institution. One by one, states are adopting laws permitting the use, and I think, again, you're seeing that across the panel here because of its medical purposes. Again, just to echo that, what you're seeing right now largely is across the board a cash industry, and there is, as you can hear, a lack of access to financial services. So it's not just the big banks, it's not just the Chases and the TDs, it's us as well, it's everybody. They're operating on a cash basis in financial institutions. We can't serve the businesses without running into federal laws, creating enormous barriers for us dealing with marijuana-related businesses. So not just not the stores, but anybody associated with that industry. The issues are obviously, I don't want to say obviously, but the issues are one, as an all-cash basis business, it's obviously a safety concern for the employees and the owners, and that creates a risk for public safety as well. And then, of course, as Michael stated, there's this feeling of not wanting to accept cash as payment. The term cash is king is long gone, and so that creates a big issue from paying anything as simple as, again, your accountant to your taxes. One of the new barriers that could further prevent a cannabis company to accessing legal financial services is the Small Business Administration guidance release by the Trump administration in 2018 that prohibits lending to marijuana and hemp-related businesses. That's through the SBA, and to business that work with them. So again, that's looking at any one-off from that. So somebody selling a greenhouse or equipment to the accountant. These factors make the cannabis industry unique and expensive, and that's one of the things I've heard time and time again, just on the panel and in general, is why are the fees higher? Why is it so much more? And as a financial institution, there's unique due diligence that's required of our lending staff, our commercial lending staff, to develop this expertise in how this industry works. Again, echoing the fact that it's brand new, relatively speaking, legally brand new, I guess you could say. And so we have to develop this program. Obviously, there's seed to sale monitoring that needs to occur, and then the extensive paperwork that goes along with it. So really, it's very expensive to try to serve these organizations. At the federal level, the most important thing we need to see right now as financial institutions is safe harbor legislation that gives credit unions a safe harbor to legally provide banking services to cannabis companies in states where cannabis is legal. There is a bill currently in the House that would do that. The credit unions have been advocating for to support. That's HR 1595, and that's Safe and Fair Enforcement. Secure and Fair Enforcement, an acronym SAFE Banking Act of 2019, that would create protections for depository institutions that provide financial services to cannabis-related businesses and service providers. We made it through the House Financial Services Committee on March 28th and will now be brought to floor for a full vote for the House. So that's a good sign from a federal standpoint. This legislation has gotten further along than it has many years prior. So we're hopeful that something like this is going to come down that's going to allow it to become more prevalent from a financial services standpoint. The second question that was on here is, what can the state do? What would we need to see at the state level as a financial institution? And we've felt pretty much as an industry that the state has been pretty proactive, and we appreciate that. Credit unions will continue to urge the state to put out guidance on the issue, and they've delivered up to this point as well, and been very educational, I guess you can say, and vocal about getting involved. Back in July of 2018, the governor directed the Department of Financial Services to provide guidance to support the safe and sound provision of banking services for medical marijuana and industrial hemp businesses. And we felt, again, that that was a very good job of getting guidance up and active in New York State starting in July of 2018. And then beyond that, credit unions begin to operate in this space. We would ask for backing at the state level if the legal status remains unchanged at the federal level. So as you could tell from my disclaimer before, we don't currently operate in this space, but if we should decide to, based on what's happening in New York, we would appreciate the support from the state level. And then the last thing was basically in regards to fees, and that they've heard that there have been that there are significantly higher fees for this business. If it were legalized, would the fees continue to be in place, and would they be as high as they are now? In the short-term, immediate future, there's no doubt there will continue to be substantial compliance costs if the legal status of cannabis remains unchanged at the federal level. If the federal government legalizes cannabis and legalizes certain aspects of the industry, like the Safe Harbor for States Act, then like anything else, the lower risk would likely accompany by lower compliance costs. And I have to agree with Michael to say that as this industry matures, and you're seeing more players getting involved, then you will see that overall, I would think you would see the overall fee structure go down, in general. And again, I'm speaking on behalf of credit unions, being a nonprofit financial cooperative. So, really just right now, being that a credit union cannot engage in the cannabis business or even tangentially related businesses, so those second and third degrees out, with it being so challenging from a paperwork and standpoint, we're staying out of it at the moment because of that climate. And I can say we as Visions Credit Union, so we are the largest financial institution, bank or credit union in Broome County. We do commercial lending, we do commercial accounts, and so in our community, we are the financial institution that a lot of people look to when it comes time to either get their first small business loan or even when it comes time to buy their first house. So, we position ourselves as a community partner and want to continue to be that. So, would just ask for that continued support on the state level as we hopefully can help watch this industry become more mature.
I thank you. I thank you for that. I have a couple of questions for the panel. Let's see. To no one in particular, what do you think of the idea of the state opening up a state bank?
I would support that. I think that would be great. What I mentioned before, and I don't think you had gotten here yet for my for what I said, but the compliance related to that is immense. And we had applied for a loan through ESD, a Job Development Authority loan for a construction project as we expand our facility. We were denied the loan because we're a cannabis company, not because we didn't qualify. We met all the qualifications, but they didn't feel that they could keep up with the regulatory compliance. So if a part of New York State that already deals with money and loans and that kind of thing doesn't feel like they have the capacity to handle cannabis money, I think it's going to take a lot of work to stand up a bank.
Might have been interesting if they had, just playing with the idea, if they had offered a grant. Might have got
So we
the
applied
ball.
for a grant as well, and we're
Oh.
denied too.
And were turned down. Well, it was interesting. Any more conversation on the idea?
I think that's something we would be incredibly supportive of. It would prevent a viable solution for the worker component of this, obviously be a place for workers to go and bank, and it's ideally a trusted place to go and bank, and for us, it would be a solution to setting up retirement accounts for our members. So I think that's something we would love to see explored.
2 more positions. I'll let you speak last.
Thank you.
So I think that would be a great idea. I think that a state bank would have the advantage of also providing a demonstration of what the state believes are best practices, and the folks empowered by policymakers like you directly through the creation who's appointed to run it. That would give people, I think, a sense of what New York State is looking for. My understanding is that the challenges tend to be in terms of timing and the lift and how long it would take to get something like that up and running. But I think that it would certainly be a great boon to the industry if it existed.
What major compliance problems would you find?
I'm sorry, the compliance problems that, I think that what often comes up is a question of how the banks determine, banks or credit unions, that the operators who they're dealing with are following the law, and that they are following the system that you all have set up, New York on the medical side, and will hopefully set up on the adult use side. And so that tends to be where the compliance challenge is, figuring out how you can tell that someone is in compliance with those. And with a more robust regulatory system, that tends to be easier, but everybody sort of waits to see who can figure out how to do this in a given state.
Sir, you're enthusiastic about this idea.
Yeah, well, I would say, again, this is more my own personal opinion. My only concerns would be the time it would take to get that established and get the word out and get people activated and engaging with that bank. And the other concern would just be the overall cost. As again, we're looking at the services we provide to our membership. We are a long time established financial institution. And we already have a lot of these individuals, their personal accounts or their other businesses accounts and things. So I guess that would be my only thoughts or concerns on something like that. But yeah.
All right. Anybody seen any best practices in other states that may be useful to us? Who's at the cutting edge of this stuff? California?
For bank,
Yes.
I would actually say in New York, I think all of the ROs have bank accounts right now. In California, you generally don't see many people with bank accounts. So proportionally, New York has a larger percentage that are banked than I think California does. I think everybody's struggling with it. I don't know that there's a state to turn to. I know in Colorado, there's a lot of small state banks that are accepting cannabis money. But then what you run into with smaller banks is they have a capacity on how large your account can be, how much cash they can hold. So now they've maxed out their account, and now you've got to find another small state bank. And so oftentimes...
How much are those accounts? Just put me in a ballpark.
That I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Please.
So that I know that they're banking now in multiple different small banks, and then the rest is being stored in warehouses. So I think it's really a problem in every state. But I do think in New York would be unique if they were able to give loans directly and provide that kind of startup capital to businesses. And I think that could be a great step forward in providing financing, particularly for smaller, like a dispensary owner or ancillary businesses, because I don't think that exists in any other state.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I mean, I would
Best
just say,
practices.
from the credit union industry, obviously, this is still a fairly new topic. And so, we're not only we are cooperative with each other as well. So we are definitely looking across the board and looking for those that are creating the best practices, because I don't know if any exist currently, but they're being created. So we're definitely, as financial institutions, communicating across the board to try and establish those, and feel that our trade associations do a fairly well job at educating us in best practices as they come down. So I wouldn't be surprised if you saw that happen either at the state level or at a federal level from our associations educating and sharing those best practices.
I know that my office is exploring the concept of a 401k, 529-ish, some hybrid for workers in this. Any assistance that you can be would be very useful as we try to figure this. The idea of paying our workers and telling them, put some of the money away for your future retirement or for your health or whatever, it's just not going to happen. It's just in most cases, I'm sure there's one or two diligent people who probably are your customers, no doubt, who will do these things, but the majority of people are not going to do it, and that leaves a problem in the future when they seek to retire. Well, there we go thinking. So if there's anyone who has any ideas on this, please, Khadija there has been at the forefront of this. She was volunteered to do this. Let's see, currently banking, best practices state. Any final suggestions for New York State?
One thing I forgot to mention is that I think that there needs to be greater transferability allowances than what was proposed in the executive budget proposal. Right now, it said for MWBE and social justice applicants or licenses that were granted, you could only sell and transfer your license to another MWBE or social justice applicant. Not only do I think that that puts an unnecessary restriction, and you're already dealing with populations that have limited access to financing, so therefore the ability for these companies or these individuals to profit in the same way that MWBE licenses could, I think is an unfair restriction. But the second aspect of it is if you can't find the capital to keep your business going and you have to go out of business, you actually don't get federal bankruptcy protection because you're federally illegal. So not having an easy transferability of these licenses will put these people in jeopardy, and they won't have the standard access to protections in the case of bankruptcy. So I do think that that needs to be also considered.
Let's speak about that on another day. I'm the father of MWBE in New York City, having written Local Law 1 and Local Law 129. The difficulty with what you're saying is, what is to prevent monopolization? What is to prevent the big guys from just saying, hey, I'm gonna buy every small one that's there until finally it's gone? It's not an easy thing to solve, but if you have some insights,
So one of the FinCEN and Cole memo initiatives was actually having a residency requirement of the individuals in the company. So I think having residence, and like what Colorado's done, would be important and would actually help with FinCEN banking guidelines, because part of it is showing that you're not an interstate entity, and so having all state residents would actually help with banking compliance. The other aspect of that would mean that you would limit public corporations from coming in, potentially, but I'm not an attorney, so, but I do think that could help. I think being very conscious about how and who is licensed is important. I think that the 3-tier model can help that, but I'm not sure that it will be prevented. I think that the best option is also to have liquidity, to make sure that there aren't too many licenses given, because let's say tomorrow we have 500 dispensaries in the state of New York, in theory, and tomorrow federal status changes. That's a scarce resource where you could actually get out and, people will buy the farm. If you are in Oregon, where there are way too many dispensary licenses, already they're going out of business. And if you change the federal status, they have no value. And so I think that what you really can do is prepare for the future, but I don't know that you can really prevent that long term, unfortunately, but I have tried to think about ways.
I thought of the taxi medallions in New York City when you spoke of Oregon, where the taxi medallions had great value, and people took incredible loans to get them. And the market changed. I won't mention any names. The market changed, and now those medallions are perhaps worth 1/3 of what they were before, which has led to incredible problems. In terms of the dilemma that we were speaking of, might be interesting to have to sell, for an MWBE, to sell back to the state, if you wish.
Or, if I know the intent is to make sure that if you apply as an MWBE and you get a license as an MWBE, that you stay that, and that's really your intent. So there could be a limit, over 5 years, you can't do that, but finding capital, as we addressed here, is so difficult that, most of the times when I go to venture capital organizations, they want the controlling interest of my company, which means I would cease to be an MWBE. So I have limited options as a woman in finding funding, which is across all industries. The other thing is, you could pay sort of like a transfer tax. Let's say I'm selling to a public company.
Interesting.
Now, a public licensing fee might be $1 million, whereas my licensing fee, annual licensing fee or entry fee or something is $10,000. Now, if I'm selling to a public company, the transfer tax is going to be $990,000 or whatever. And so then you have that, and that goes back to the state. So you make up the difference somewhere, and the state can also make money off of that. And it would be sort of a barrier to entry, because then there would have to be more money that the public company would have to give to get into the.
I hope that you're dealing with Khadija a great deal, because I'm going to say to her, did you get all of that? And of course, she knows it all. Sir?
I would just mention, those are all very compelling goals and issues. What I would like to raise is that there are countervailing points, and there's this tension, and you don't have an easy job as the policymakers of threading the needle. Because, for example, you use the example of taxi medallions. Taxi medallions used to be very expensive, and that would price out a lot of the folks who you might want to give these medallions to, the people who are disadvantaged, to switch back to the cannabis industry, the people who don't have the same access to financing. It can be very expensive to put together a cultivation operation, a processing operation. All of these things cost a lot of money, and you need a lot of financing. The more expensive the license is, that's an additional burden on them. And I think that you also have that same issue. The tighter the restrictions that you place on ownership, on who can own, let's say that you are the exact kind of person who you might want to, for social equity reasons, give a license to. That person may have challenges getting money through the traditional banking system, but they may have, if they're very lucky, an uncle, an aunt, a cousin in a number of other states who believe in them, who are willing to help finance their business, the friends and family model. They may not have all those people in New York, and the tighter the restrictions that you place on it, it may be easier for some big players. There are lots of very wealthy individuals in New York. There are going to be people who can meet that residency requirement, but you may, if you draw it too tightly, create something that is counterproductive and not what you actually wanted to do. So it's a very challenging issue, and there are compelling considerations on both sides.
Very well put. Well, I want to thank this panel for putting up with the glare and of the spotlight. You had your 15 minutes of fame. Mine is yet to come. But with that, I really appreciate your insights. We're going to follow up with you as we try to figure how to thread this needle. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let me do something unusual. I'm noted for these things. I believe that sometimes the answer may be in the very audience we have. A question that we've been speaking about, banking and marijuana, draws experts from all over. Is there an expert out there who believes that they have an answer for New York State? If there is, you're running out the wrong way. My. Now that's when you ask the right questions. If this expert does exist, I invite them to come down and identify themselves, and let's put you into the conversation. Khadija, would you mind sharing with Senator Savino what's going on? So if there is an expert, this is your moment. So you have heard what's going on in terms of we're wrestling with some of the hardest questions. I'm happy and sad to hear that New York State is at the cutting edge. I would prefer someone else right now. I prefer to learn from them. But we are absolutely wrestling with these questions. We are going to address the issue of, from the workers' point of view, making sure that the workers are held harmless. But we're also going to look at the situation for what is happening with the banks. Of course, the federal level is the most important one. Would you be kind enough to bring my colleague up to date? The federal level is the most important one that is going on. However, we do need to find a way, as we indeed will look for a way. What is happening is that we have a commissioner from the, let's see if I can do this, the Commissioner of Cannabis Control from Massachusetts, who is traveling in to see us. And the commissioner is going to be here, I'm told, by 1 o'clock. So under these conditions, on one hand, I might not, well, I'm going to allow that. I'm going to bring us into a recess because I'm hoping that the commissioner from a state that has legalized this may have some of the answers to the questions. Having said that, I am glad, I will see if my colleague in government wants to make a statement, and then I'm going to call us into a recess. Is there anything that you want to add, Madam Senator?
Thank you, Senator Sanders. I am happy to be here, and sorry I was late. We had an environmental conservation meeting. I represent Syracuse and Central New York in the state Senate, and some of the concerns that we have, in addition to the concerns elsewhere in the state, have to do with how this will impact agriculture. And so I'm interested to hear more information about how we separate hemp farming from cannabis farming and other related issues related to agriculture and agricultural labor and agricultural, the whole impact on the agricultural economy. So those are my particular interests in this hearing. Thank
Well,
you.
I think that you are showing that you take your responsibilities very seriously, because this issue will certainly impact on all of the ones that you were speaking of. So, having said that, my friends, we're going to go into recess, and we will come back at 1 o'clock to hear from the commissioner. Thank you very much. If anyone wants to speak to us informally, this is your moment. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back to this session. I am Senator James Sanders, Jr., and I'm the chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Banks. To my left is, of course, Senator Diane Savino, the former chair, and she's had so many things under her hat. But what makes her especially interesting here, I would suggest, is that she is the author of the medical marijuana bill and has done a lot of work, medical marijuana law, and has done a lot of work on this issue. And I really want to take a moment to say thank you for giving me the education that you have so far, and the education in the future I look forward to. I also want to thank Khadija Peak before I forget, and I want to thank you for helping to put this whole session together. And you did a great job in doing that, and the rest of my staff. You always duck under that, Khadija. Yes, that's all right. We're going to learn this business. Before I introduce and call on our illustrious commissioner, is there anything that you want to say?
No, I actually look forward to hearing what the commissioner has to say, and let's get to it.
We are honored to have been joined by Commissioner Stephen Hoffman, who is from the Cannabis Control Commission of Massachusetts. And of course, Massachusetts has been a leader on this, in this issue. We are going to hear from him, and afterwards I will allow my senator, if she wishes to say anything, to say that. Mr. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come down here today. When we got started, which was September of 2017, we were appointed.
Into the mic, sir.
Yeah, When we were appointed in September of 2017, one of the first things we did is reach out to the states that had preceded us, like Colorado and Oregon and Washington, and they were extraordinarily helpful. They answered our questions. They told us about things they wish they could have learned earlier or done differently, and it just feels appropriate for us to return that service to the states that are succeeding us. So it's a great honor to be here, and I'm happy to make a few remarks and then answer whatever questions you might have, and I have a pretty open calendar, so I'm yours for as long as you'd like me. What I thought I would do is just give everybody kind of grounding in terms of how the industry has evolved in Massachusetts, where we are now, and then talk about some remaining issues, because while I'm very proud of what we've done thus far in the year and a half that we've been in business, we have a lot more work to do. So the history in Massachusetts is that medical marijuana was legalized by voter referendum in December of 2012. Long before I was in state government. By the way, my background is entirely in the private sector. I was retired in 2016. I was not doing very well at retirement. I was bored and looking for something to do that was going to be different and new than what I had done for the last 40-plus years. And when I got appointed in September 2017, it was my first time in the public sector, my first time dealing with the media, so I'm still learning after a year and a half, hopefully. So 2012, the voters of Massachusetts approved medical marijuana. The margin was pretty substantial. It was over 60% in favor. It took a few years, and again, that was before my time. It took a few years until the first dispensaries opened in Massachusetts. That was about 2014. Right now, there are 59 operating medical dispensaries in Massachusetts. When the medical program started, it was under the regulatory authority of the Department of Public Health. In the legislation that created our commission, we took over that program December of 2018. But our commission was appointed to stand up the adult use market for cannabis in the state of Massachusetts. Again, it was started by a voter initiative in December of 2016, question 4. Unlike medical marijuana, the vote was quite close. So in Massachusetts, 53% of the citizens voted in favor, 47% were opposed, so a pretty close ballot initiative. The legislature in Massachusetts, almost the next day, put a hold on everything, and they announced that they were going to put together a joint House and Senate study committee and spend 6 months looking at the issue before they decided whether to let the voter initiative go ahead. It actually took them 8 months. Governor Baker signed the legislation July 27th of 2017. And for the most part, question 4 went ahead as the voters intended. There were a few changes with respect to the tax rate went up a little bit. There were more explicit requirements for local say and local control. And our commission, a 5-person commission, which in the voter initiative had been part of the treasurer's office, in the legislation signed by Governor Baker, we became a 5-person independent commission. So we were appointed by the treasurer, the governor, and the attorney general collectively, but we do not report to anybody. And I was talking before to Senator Sanders. I can say there's some pros and cons, which I'm happy to talk about, of being an independent commission. We got appointed in September of 2017, and one of the here's the con of being an independent commission, which is there were 5 commissioners. We had no office, we had no staff, and we had no money. And we had a piece of legislation that had some incredibly short timeframes and mandates. So we did get the money. We have hired a staff. We found ourselves temporary office space, which we're still in. We're moving to permanent headquarters in December. But we literally, from day one, just got going and rolled up our sleeves. We have tried to do this in an incredibly inclusive manner. So the first thing we did was we went out and did 10 public listening sessions around the state. We didn't say anything, we just said, tell us what you think. And they were incredibly well-attended sessions. We then came back, I'm sorry, I don't know New York state law. In Massachusetts, we are subject to the open meeting law. And the open meeting law in Massachusetts says that anytime there's more than 2 commissioners, whenever there's a quorum, any conversation we have on this topic has to be conducted in public. So we've done everything in public. And while I kid and say the open meeting law is perhaps the best law to cause us to operate as efficiently as possible, it's still the right thing. So we have operated openly, we've operated inclusively. We spent, after the public listening sessions, we spent 4 days in a row in public talking about policies, what kind of licenses we were going to issue, what was our licensing process and requirements going to be, how are we going to enforce, and so forth. We had 4 days of public debates on that, and then a week later we came back, and based upon the decisions we made, we voted on a set of draft regulations embodying those policies. We then promulgated those draft policies or draft regulations through the Secretary of State, and then had a formal public comment period where we did another 10 statewide sessions to get comments on our draft regulations, and we also encouraged written submissions. That was a 6-week period. We then got back together in February of 2018, made some changes to our draft regulations based upon the feedback and the comments that we got, and then finalized our regulations on March 15th of 2018, which was a legislative mandate. So we met that mandate. Next mandate was to start accepting applications on April 1st, which we did, and then the final mandate was a negative mandate, which is we could not give out licenses until June 1st of 2018, so we didn't. Our first provisional license was issued on June 20th of 2018. So here we are right now. Let me just, before I give you some statistics, we have a 3-step licensing process that we developed. First step is a provisional license, and there's 4 components that people need to fulfill to get a provisional license. One is an application fee. We have kept our application fees deliberately low to try to reduce barriers to entry into this industry. Second is we need a list, a roster of everybody that's going to be associated with the business in a management or an investment position, and they have to agree to allow us to do background checks on each of those individuals. Third, they submit an operations profile, which tells us essentially how they're going to run the business, whether it's cultivation, manufacturing, retail, or whatever, and we review that to get comfort that the people that are applying can run a business that will adhere to our regulations. And then the fourth thing we do is we ask them where they're going to locate the business, and we send a notice to the city or town in which they're planning on operating, and we give the city or town 60 days to get back to us to assure or to tell us that all of their local zoning and other ordinances have been met. If all 4 of those things happen, we give a provisional license, which does not give the entity the opportunity to possess marijuana or to actually do anything other than to prepare their facility consistent with the operating plan they gave us. We then, when they tell us they're ready, go out and do a final inspection to make sure that the facility matches the operating plan, and we give them a final license in that case. And then there's one last step, which is when they have a final license, they are still not authorized to sell marijuana. What they are licensed to do is possess marijuana, and they have to enter their marijuana into our seed-to-sale tracking system. So everybody has a license in Massachusetts is required to be on a seed-to-sale tracking system. We chose a vendor called Metric, which is one that's used by most states around the country.
We use it.
Yeah. And when you get your final license, you get a license to Metric, and you're allowed to put your inventory into Metric. Once you've put your inventory into Metric, we come back to do a final inspection, compare what's in Metric to the physical inventory, and if it matches, we give people a certificate to commence operations. So that's the process. We have issued, at this point, we just had a public meeting last Thursday, the 4th. We have issued 140 provisional licenses, including 43 cultivators, 37 product manufacturers, 50 retailers, 2 transporters, 3 independent testing labs, and 3 micro businesses. The law in Massachusetts is that everything that is sold at retail has to be tested by an independent testing laboratory. You can have up to 3, any individual or entity can have up to 3 licenses at any one of the levels of the supply chain. So you can have 3 cultivation licenses, 3 manufacturing licenses, 3 retail licenses, but if you have a license for an independent lab, you cannot have any other license. And so that's an important part of the law. And of those licenses that we have, the provisional licenses that we have given out, 50 are to retailers, 15 are currently open. One of the things that we've done in Massachusetts is a little different than other states that preceded us, is we did not try to open broadly. A couple of states that actually legalized the same time we did, California and Nevada, did open very broadly from our perspective, and it's hard to be critical because every state's unique, and there really are some big challenges, but hi. With respect to California, they opened broadly. They did not have their licensing system in place yet, so people did not have background checks, and they were operating on provisional licenses. They also didn't have their seed-to-sale tracking in place yet, so people were doing inventory literally on paper. In the case of Nevada, they opened broadly, and they had stores open, but they had no inventory in those stores. So in the case of Massachusetts, we did a much more deliberate rollout. We have taken an incredible amount of pressure and grief because of that, but I will defend the way we did it. We've always said that we are much more focused on what the industry looks like in 2020 and 2021 than any arbitrary dates sooner than that. But the other thing that has caused the rollout to be slow is that in Massachusetts, as I said, there is a very strong tradition of local rule. And so the legislation that was passed that created our commission, the only agency that gives out licenses in Massachusetts is the state, our agency. But the cities and towns have a big say in the matter. So first, cities and towns can outright ban marijuana establishments in their town. And of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, 43 have done so.
Wait, say that again?
Out of 351 cities and towns, 43 have banned marijuana establishments in their town.
Towns and villages, but not counties.
Not counties, this is all municipal city towns.
So you don't.
California is very
extend
much
to
on a county basis. We're very
Okay.
much on a locality, city or town basis. So, it's really kind of a great laboratory because there's 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, and they're all doing this a little differently.
But that's important.
Yeah, no, I think that,
How many started by banning it? Did it lighten as time goes on?
no, it was pretty quick. So the way the law in Massachusetts is, and this is one of the things that changed from the voter initiative to what Governor Baker ultimately signed. In the final legislation, the world was divided into two pieces. So those cities and towns that voted in favor of question 4 could not ban without going through a subsequent voter initiative, which several have done.
Interesting.
Those that voted against question 4 in 2016 could ban just through whatever the town governing function was, town meeting or board of selectmen or mayor or whatever. If they voted against it, that's all it took to ban. And so almost immediately upon us finalizing our regulations, 43 cities and towns banned any kind of marijuana. And they don't, they didn't have to, they could have banned just retail and allowed for manufacturing or laboratories, but most of them just banned every kind of establishment, of those 43. The other thing that happened, and this again is about local control, and I don't hear anything I'm saying as being critical or complaining, this is just the way it worked in Massachusetts. 135 cities and towns applied to the secretary, or excuse me, to the attorney general for moratoriums. Moratoriums were not bans, they were essentially planning tools saying, okay, now that we've seen the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations, we need time to do our own local stuff. And I, cynically would say that nobody expected us to get our regulations done on time, and I think they were all surprised when we did. And so there was a flurry of activity right afterwards, and 135 cities and towns got moratoriums. They had to apply to the Attorney General. They had to be finite, so they couldn't be open-ended moratoriums. And most of them expired December 31st of 2018. A couple have gotten extensions from the Attorney General, but most of them have expired. But we are not, until those moratoriums expired, we could not issue licenses at the state level. So that's another thing that, so we both had a strategy of going slowly to begin with, but then the municipal process really slowed us down as well.
Of the licenses that you have issued up until now, the numbers you said again earlier, was it 49 cultivation centers?
Let me give you the numbers again. I had them a few seconds ago. Here we go.
Wow,
43 cultivators. These are provisional licenses, not
Right.
final licenses, but 43 cultivators, 37 product manufacturers, 50 retailers, 2 transporters. And let me just pause on transporters for a second. The medical industry in Massachusetts, the medical
vertically
marijuana industry, is vertically integrated. We deliberately did not do that. We want to make, again, the barriers to entry as low as possible, so you can just get a cultivation license. But because they're independent, we needed to essentially create an industry to move product between entities, and those are the transporter licenses.
Of the medical licenses and/or the new, of the adult use, are they all provisional still, or some
No,
of them?
so medical has 49
49.
operating dispensaries in Massachusetts.
What about cultivation? It's
And then medical is vertically integrated, so all those licenses are cultivation, manufacturing, and dispensing.
Of the 49 original medical
Right.
that are vertically integrated, how many of them are still being held by the original license applicants?
It's a good question. We've just taken over the program. In Massachusetts, the medical licenses were issued to not-for-profit corporations.
Was that a requirement in
That
the
was a
law?
requirement in the original law.
Makes it only even more hard.
Yeah. Some of this happened before our time. I am aware right now of 7 entities that have come to us, our commission, and requested a transfer of license to a new owner. So that's 7. I don't know how many might have occurred before we took responsibility for the program in December. I don't think very many, but I'm aware of 7 entities that have sold. So we can't stop a company from selling to another company. What we can and do is look at the new company, make sure that we're comfortable giving a transfer.
And the reason I ask is because you weren't here earlier today when we took testimony from either the Drug Policy Alliance or people who are in the industry now, the incredible expense that goes into first getting a license, maintaining a license, staying in the business.
Yes.
And then servicing this business and the complications of access to capital and credit and all of the tax implications. And so some of the original medical licenses that were issued in New York State under a very narrow program originally, which was not what we originally envisioned, but the executive did, created even higher hurdles. Even higher hurdles for them to overcome. And so of the first 5 license holders, 3 of them were already taken over by other entities.
Yep.
And I think of the next 5, 2 of them have been taken over by other entities because they just couldn't turn a profit under
And the fact of the matter is,
restrictions.
since Canada legalized at the federal level, which was about 6 months ago, there are at least a dozen companies that have gone public on the Toronto Stock
Right.
Exchange, raised lots and lots of money, and that money is coming into the states, including into Massachusetts. And so part of it is whether the original owners can make a go of it, but part of it is there's a lot of money coming into the state. We do have caps on ownership and control, so you can control, as I said, 3 retail, 3 cultivation, and 3 manufacturing licenses. Just in the spirit of complete disclosure, the Boston Globe has been doing a spotlight series on are people using shell corporations and dummy corporations to disguise ownership. We are investigating what happened before we took over in the Department of Public Health, but none of the entities that we've licensed thus far have been sold, although there are a couple of pending transactions. So it's clearly a big issue.
That's an interesting question. So the earlier testimony, one of the license holders in New York State, Etain, they talked about the challenges they face with access to capital. And they're, and they're in a much better position than some other startups, but they had applied for some funding through the state's ESDC, or Empire State Development Corporation,
Right.
for a grant or a loan. They were turned down by the state's Department of Empire State Development Corporation, saying that they didn't have the capacity to process a loan because of the complexities of the cannabis industry. Can't even make that up. That was the first thing.
I won't comment.
But they also talked about that there's a lot of venture capital in this business, and a lot of it comes from companies who have gone public in Canada who then come into other states that are legal, and they provide venture capital to startups. Your licensing scheme in Massachusetts, and I don't say scheme in a negative way, that's just the way we refer to it, and the proposal in the governor's bill, and I also believe it exists in Senator Kruger and Assemblywoman People-Stokes' bill, would prevent vertical integration in the adult use market as a condition of a license, and also prevents you from having an interest in any. So if you have a cultivation license, you cannot have an interest, an investment, or an ownership, or any other way in another license. That would close the door on some of this venture capital in the industry. So I'm not sure whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and I think we really need to look at that.
I think like a lot of things, it's not good or bad. It's the kind of question, what's the most important thing you're trying to accomplish? Capital in this industry is an incredibly big challenge, particularly as you know, we have a very major social equity component to our law with the requirement that we ensure that those citizens of communities disproportionately impacted by previous marijuana enforcement are full participants in the industry.
Where do you get the money from, though, for the
Well,
social equity fund?
That's the $99,000 million question, which is where to get the money. Because I was, when you were talking about your state fund turning people down because it was too complex, our state fund has said they're not going to participate because they get federal funding. So,
Interesting.
So we are currently working with. We are currently working with legislators in Massachusetts to see if we can create a state interest-free loan fund. It would have to come from a set of different sources, legislative appropriation or reallocation of existing monies. We have this will segue into tax a little bit. Our tax rate is 20%. At retail only, which is, I think, different than what you guys are working on, but at retail, it's 20%, comprised of a 6.25% state sales tax, which goes into the general fund, a 3% tax that can be collected by the municipality, if they so choose, and goes directly to the municipality, even though our Department of Revenue collects it, but then sends it right back to the city or town. And then there is a 10.75% excise tax. The excise tax first goes to fund our commission, but we're cheap. We're operating as frugally as we possibly can. And then there are 7 mandated uses of whatever is left over, including restorative justice programs, first responder training, educational programs. But again, this is my education in state government. There are these prescribed uses for this money, and then the last line of that section of the legislation says, subject to legislative appropriation, which means
Right.
you can do with it whatever you want.
What's the total tax liability?
Pardon?
What's the total tax liability on a?
So it's 20% total.
Okay.
Only at retail, 6.25% state sales tax, 3% a discretionary tax that can be charged by the city or town in which the retailer is operating, and 10.75% excise tax. Okay. So in the funding for what I'm working with the legislature is the potential to divert some of that excise tax into this fund. And then the final source is that I'm trying to figure out a way to have a state fund with a 501c3 underneath it so we can get private contributions. And I'm totally convinced that the industry will support this if the state does. So, but this is incredibly early stage.
You just have one more question.
But social justice and social equity initiatives, in my opinion, are important and necessary, but will not work unless the financing issue is solved.
Right, so I have one more question, and then I promise I will be.
I'm
I know
happy.
they have a
I'm
million-
happy
they
to
have
answer questions.
In an effort to achieve that goal, of all of the new applicants and the provisional licenses that have been issued by the state of Massachusetts, how many of the applicants have been eligible for minority women-owned businesses?
Yeah, it's not good. So in our legislation, there were 2 groups that were given priorities. So whenever they applied, they get to go to the front of the queue. One was the operating medical dispensaries. And the second were what we called economic empowerment candidates who were from these disproportionately impacted communities. The fact of the matter is that most of the licenses we've issued so far are to existing medical operators, just because they had the wherewithal. They were at the front of the queue, they had the money, and they had the wherewithal. So we have a fair number of general applicants, but it's about 93% white males that are running these businesses.
Outside the medical applicants?
No, I'm talking about the entire business. Outside the medical applicants, well, most of the provisional licenses we've issued thus far are for medical, are for people that are adding adult use to their medical license. So this is something that, we are nowhere near where we need to be. It is something that I think is a strong argument for moving slowly. If we had opened 200 stores on day one, they would have all gone to the medical. The medical operators were going to be the only people ready to do that. So by moving a little bit more slowly, we're giving time. And we have many things going on in terms of social equity. We have a social equity program where we're providing training and mentoring. In every license application is a requirement that the applicant says, what are we going to do to support these objectives? One being diversity, the second being social equity. And a lot of them are really stepping up. So we've got people that have gotten licenses that are doing incubators and doing accelerators, training programs, outreach. So a lot's going on, but without financing, we're not going to crack this.
We will return to that view, but first I want to offer, and we've been joined by Assemblywoman Buttonshun And she, of course, has brought a whole school here.
Hi.
And, oh my goodness, since you have brought so many people and since I've ruined your name I will allow you to ask any question that you wish. It's good to see you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Yes, these are pharmacy students from DUville, which is in the western part of the state, that had been visiting my office, and I had explained the importance of this informative hearing. I am here to listen. I have many more questions that come to my office than I have answers for. So today's panel, I appreciate you sponsoring this and providing the opportunity for us, as well as these very inquisitive students that have many questions. So I'm appreciative that they are here today also, so thank you for being here. I just have a question. You started when? You said December of 18?
No, our commission was appointed September 1st, 2017.
September 1,
And
17.
it stood up to, or it was created to stand up the adult use industry. December of 2018, we took over responsibility for the medical program as well, which had previously been under the Department of Public Health.
Okay. And if you were to tell us, what would you see as your biggest challenge that you face in one little?
I was asked that on a radio show yesterday, and I said, I can't answer that question. I can tell you about the 4 biggest challenges, but I'm not sure I can tell you about one. So, and this is not in a particular order of importance because they're all critical. One is what we were just talking about, which is we have very explicit social equity mandates in our legislation that we will not be able to fulfill if we can't figure out a way to get financing to these individuals. So that's certainly one. The second, and I know is something that we were, I was asked to talk about today. Second is banking. And the federal prohibition on banking has created a situation where this is mostly a cash industry. And it is very difficult to get cash management services provided by banks. We have done a lot. I was talking previously. We've worked with the Mass Bankers Association, with the Cooperative Credit Union Association. I have met probably with 12 to 15 individual banks. My job is not to talk them into anything, but to say, here's how we're going to regulate the industry, here's how we're going to enforce those regulations, here's the public safety issue. And of course, the public safety issue is very straightforward, which is somebody walks out of their dispensary at 9 o'clock at night with a satchel of $50,000 in cash over their shoulders, and every criminal in the state knows that. So I'm really proud of the fact that we now have 4 banks. They're small banks, but we have 4 banks that are banking the adult use industry. Since we only have 15 retailers open, that's sufficient for the time being, but it's certainly not sufficient long term. We are putting in place regulations about how to transport the cash from the dispensary to the bank, because right now there are no regulations, and so we're working on that. The banking challenges still remain. Not only do we need more banks, but there are 2 other issues. One is the large armored car services, the Brinks and the Loomises of the world, will not pick up this cash because they are federally licensed.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they cross state lines, and so they will not pick up this cash. And that's an issue. So there are smaller players that are coming into the state, but we don't really have, I think, an adequate regulatory structure yet, because we've never in Massachusetts or any other state had to regulate armored car services because they're all federally regulated. The other issue, and I will not speak to what's going on in New York on this, the Federal Reserve of Boston will not accept this cash. Right. Now, I've learned that Federal Reserves have autonomy, because the Federal Reserve in Kansas City and the Federal Reserve in Denver will accept this cash, but the Federal Reserve in Boston will not. I don't know what the policy is of the Fed of New York.
I don't know, but I have met with someone from Colorado who said that they use the Federal Reserve out there.
Yeah,
and again, it's this patchwork of
right.
policies and approaches. The 4 banks that you use, they're state chartered banks?
There's 2 credit unions and 2 state chartered banks, yes. And they're small. I I mean, these are,
Are they just providing depository services?
yes, just depository. Nobody is lending into this industry that I'm aware of, and they all say if and when the federal law changes, we'll consider doing it. But right now, they essentially could lose their collateral on any loan they make. So none of them feel that they would be consistent with their fiduciary responsibilities to provide financing. So it's just all depository, which is important because that is the public safety issue. So.
How do you get the taxes, how is the tax delivered
Okay.
to the state of Massachusetts?
So that was a separate process. So we've worked pretty closely with the Department of Revenue. Department of Revenue has no experience taking tax payments of any kind in cash. So
They do now.
pardon?
They do now.
Well, they're starting. So they put together a task force that I was on, and what they've done is they have created 2 depositories in Massachusetts, one in Chelsea, which is just outside of Boston, and one in Springfield. And these are in existing Department of Revenue facilities with separate entrances, separate rooms, where people can make cash payments for tax purposes. They have successfully gotten Brinks to pick up the cash in these depositories and Bank of America to accept these depositories because the state does a lot of business with them. Plus, the state has said, we'll take any kind of tax payments to these facilities, not just marijuana tax. So the Department of Revenue is getting their money. Now, because banks have come into the industry, at least in its nascent form, most of the payments, the tax payments have been electronic up to this point. They haven't taken a lot of cash payments, but they set up those facilities to do so.
Crazy.
Madam, will you finish, Madam?
I only had one other question.
Sure.
What is the best piece of advice you could provide us in the state of New York as legislators as we attempt to move forward?
That's a good question. I would say recognize the complexity, recognize the controversial nature and the division in public opinion on this, and go slowly. Think about think about the long term and focus on the long term rather than hitting any short arbitrary targets.
Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you. Madam
Now,
Senator.
by the way, that advice does not make me very popular in some parts of the state.
So I also have a couple questions. I'm a senator from Syracuse and part of upstate New York. And some of the issues that we're concerned about have to do with the impact on the farming community. And
Sure.
I'm just curious about what your experience has been in Massachusetts.
So, in our legislation, there is some very explicit language about making this work for farmers in general in the state of Massachusetts, but particularly for small farmers. So we've done a couple of things, and it's early, so I can't declare victory, but I think we've done a few things. One is that we've allowed explicitly for farming co-ops to get a license. So small farmers can come together and share the development and the licensing costs. We require that they operate under standard co-op rules, but we do have a category for co-ops, and we've got a couple of licenses pending for co-ops. Second is we've tiered our cultivation licenses in terms of the canopy, and for the smaller canopy sizes, we've put relatively low licensing and application fees in place. We have also explicitly put in place much lower application and licensing fees for outdoor cultivation versus indoor cultivation, even though Massachusetts is a pretty harsh environment, obviously, and Syracuse, I hear it's the same. I've been there in a while, but I hear it's the same. We just actually, we had a milestone at our public meeting on last Thursday. We approved our first 2 outdoor cultivation licenses. All the other cultivation licenses to this point have been indoor cultivation.
And how many is that?
We've given out 43 cultivation licenses thus far.
That's right.
And were there hemp farms in Massachusetts?
Yeah, hemp is regulated in Massachusetts by the Department of Agricultural Resources. So we don't have any regulatory. We talked to the Department of Agricultural Resources, and there's a concern with respect to outdoor cultivation. I'm not a farmer and I'm not a scientist, but apparently hemp can cross-pollinate marijuana plants, and that's a big problem. So because it's regulated by 2 separate agencies, we're working together on that, but hemp is regulated by the Department of Agricultural Resources. The other thing we've done for small farmers is we've created a category of license called microbusiness. I mentioned that in my statistics earlier. A microbusiness limits you to 5,000 square feet of canopy, but allows you, we've actually eliminated license fees, and we've eliminated application fees and halved the license fees, and we're allowing people in that category to both grow and manufacture under a relatively low threshold to, again, help small farmers participate in this.
Interesting.
Is there any effort to train, say, the minority and women-owned, or potential minority and women-owned farms to, farmers to, you know, or people to become farmers to do this?
You know, that's, I think the answer, I'm embarrassed to say, probably not. We do have training programs that target both minorities as well as people from disproportionately impacted communities. We have allowed them to tell us what they want to be trained on, and so we have training programs in entrepreneurialism, in getting a job, writing a resume, networking, re-entry. We don't have a specific program targeted to farmers or people that want to get into farmers, and I think that's actually a really good suggestion. You know, there are a lot of farming licenses that we've given out where, again, we ask them, what are you going to do to help? And so some of the licensees themselves are running some of these training programs, but the commission itself is not, and it's certainly worth considering.
Okay, thank you.
Do you allow outdoor grow?
Yes.
See, we don't. New York State's, the medical program has to be a secure indoor facility, and the proposal for the adult use program requires the same thing,
Yeah, no,
regardless of whether it was the governor's proposal.
Medical
or the-
is all
yeah.
indoor
Yeah.
in Massachusetts, but you know, in our legislation, there was a requirement that we encourage participation of small farmers and outdoor cultivation. So we explicitly have allowed that. As I said, of the 43 licenses that we've issued for cultivation, 2 thus far are for outdoor cultivation, but it is explicitly allowed.
It's very expensive to grow it outdoors.
Well, think about how
in our
expensive it is.
climate,
It's,
anyway.
it's more expensive to grow it indoors in terms of energy and HVAC requirements. I mean, one of the things that we've also done is we have an energy use task force. We put in place some pretty strict limitations on energy consumption, plus we have a task force that's working to try to find ways. In Denver, I think the statistic is that 4% of all the energy consumption in the city of Denver is from marijuana growing. So it's very expensive to grow it indoors. Outdoors, obviously, is a big issue, and you know, we have a complete ban on pesticides in the product. That will, you know, anything that has pesticides will not pass our lab testing, which makes it really difficult to grow outside. But there are, you know, there's a tradition in Massachusetts of, you know, kind of hardscrabble farmers, you know, working outside under really adverse circumstances.
And- I'm sorry.
After you.
You said you have 3, there are 3 independent laboratories that are
So far.
So we only have 1 in New York, Wadsworth Lab, it's the state lab, it's creating enough of a backlog on the medical program.
It's great. You said it's creating a backlog?
It's a serious backlog. It's the only DEA licensed lab in the state. Quite honestly, we need to expand to more laboratories.
We're not even sure that 3 is enough. 3, again, for our current scale of operation, 3 is sufficient, but I don't think it's going to be enough. So we're you know, we can't force anybody to apply for a license, but we're certainly, and of all of the license categories, the cost of entry for a lab is much higher than any other, and so it's a limitation. But 3 is sufficient for where we are right now. We do not have a backlog, but I don't think that's going to suffice long term.
Let me do a technical point, my friends, that in a hearing, typically the audience is restricted and not able to raise a question. However, if you have a question, why don't you write it down and hand it to my colleagues right there, and perhaps if there's time, we can get into it. Allow me to raise 2 questions with you, then I'm going to turn it back to my colleagues. You said that we are taxing, you only tax at the retail.
That's correct.
Aren't you missing at least 2 different sources? You're missing your growers.
Yes.
You're missing your shipper, middlemen, if you wish.
Yes.
Isn't that an unfair burden on perhaps a discrimination? It can be argued that most of the money is being made upstream. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
and the little guy is the one who's being forced to pay the taxes while the bigger guy is not being taxed at all.
Yeah, I can punt on this by saying that's what the legislation said. I had nothing to do,
Okay.
obviously, with writing the legislation. I will say, though, that, I've spoken to people that were, legislators who were involved in developing legislation, and I think that their view is the tax is kind of an educated guess right now. When they set the tax rate, and that's a little bit unfair, but when they set the tax rate, they deliberately set it kind of in the middle versus other states that have preceded us. And some states do have the value-added tax at each step of the chain, like you just described. Some states are retail only. What all the legislators that I've met have said to me is, come back and tell us whether we got this right. It's an art form because you want to generate enough revenue that is worthwhile in terms of state and city and town revenue. You don't want to create a barrier against the illicit market. You don't want to create such a big price gap. So I think that the legislature in Massachusetts is very open-minded about whether they got both the level and the structure right. And we will go back to them. I think it's right now just premature for us to feel strongly that we have a better answer. But I do think that the legislature in Massachusetts is willing to consider different rates and structures once we get a little bit more data.
I wouldn't, I should not encourage, but I will.
Well, you're more than welcome to speak to Speaker DeLeo.
Because it seems that the people who can withstand the tax the most are the wealthier growers, the guys with, well, there I go thinking again.
I have learned that my job is not to defend the law, but to implement it.
Yes, yes, yes. It's you will go far in this business, sir. As a point of information, he has gone far already. Born in New York City, mind you.
Yeah, I'm from the Bronx. I forgot to establish my credentials at the beginning here. And my wife is from Wappingers Falls.
Yeah, there. So, of course, our talent is being outsourced. We'll have to bring you home when we do this. But when you come home, you must tell me more about MWBE. It sounds like your program, I think the words you use are something about a work in progress.
For what we're doing?
Yes.
Yeah, no, look, we got appointed, the commission got appointed to staggered 5-year terms, so I'm a year and a half into my 5-year term, and I think that the legislature was both thoughtful and deliberate about that, which is, it's going to take 5 years. We're moving slowly, so it's going to just take a while until we're at maturity. Two is the cities and towns, as I said, this is an amazing experiment in local democracy. We have 351 different experiments, if you will, going on across the state.
Sounds like Massachusetts.
And I think some of them are waiting to see what the others do and learn from it. So it's going to take a while before this industry kind of gets to any kind of maturity or stability, in my opinion. The other thing is, if you look at the states that are a few years ahead of us, there are some challenges.
Yes.
Oregon has dramatic oversupply. Their prices have cratered as a result of that. We put in place some programs or some regulations that we hope can limit the oversupply, but we did not cap the number of licenses we're going to issue for any level. And so we need to see how this is going to play out over time. So I think it's going to take 4 or 5 years for us to really get a sense of whether we've built the kind of industry we want to build and whether it's met all of the objectives. The social equity programs and objectives we talked about are going to take a while just because it's taking a while to get financing into it. So it's another, back to your question and the advice, go slowly because this is hard and you really can't get it all right before you actually get it into the real world and see how it plays out and make the adjustments you need to make. And we're learning, but we're also proud of the regulations we've developed, but 100% certain they're not going to stay that way permanently because we're going to have to tweak, whether it's a tax rate to your question, whether it's the caps on cultivation, whether we can find sources of financing. I just think it takes a long time to get this right. So that's why I said it's a work in progress.
I have more questions, but I yield to my colleagues.
What triggers the issuing of new licenses? Is there are there trigger points in the program? Do you say once we've issued 50, then we do another 50, I mean.
No, we have not put any caps. So the only triggers in terms of the licensing process were the legislative mandates, which, as I said, we had to have our regulations done by March 15th of 2018. We had to start processing applications on April 1st of 2018, and we could not approve license applications until June 1st of 2018. Once we went past June 1st, we're just processing them as they come in.
But you said you want to limit the canopy.
No, we have 11 different tiers for cultivation. From under 5,000 feet, the biggest tier, Tier 11, is up to 100,000 square feet of canopy. And there are different application and licensing fees. And we also have, to try to avert the oversupply issues I was just talking
Right.
about, we have a relegation system.
So how do you learn, so I guess the point I'm trying to say is, how do you avoid becoming Oregon, which issued
by
thousands of
the
licenses?
relegation system that we have. So if you get a license, let's say, to cultivate 10,000 square feet, if you're not selling 80% of that in a given year, you get pushed down a level. So you literally cannot overproduce.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I feel really good about that, but that's theory. We're going to have to see how it works in practice, but that's the theory. And we're pretty comfortable with it, but it hasn't been tested fully yet.
You may have said this, but what has been the revenue to the state so far, and
Sure.
how does it match up with projections?
Well, the revenue projections come from the Department of Revenue. The Department of Revenue, I assume it's the same in New York, Department of Revenue has to testify to both the House and the Senate in Massachusetts in December of every year what their revenue forecast is for all forms of tax revenue, not just cannabis tax revenue, so that the legislature can decide or see how much money they have to spend, essentially. So the Department of Revenue, for the current fiscal year that we're in, which ends June 30th, has a range of $44 to $88 million with a midpoint of $63 million. In December of 2018, they made a forecast for the fiscal year starting July 1st, which was a midpoint of $133 million. They did not consult us on that forecast. I will say that I like their model. Their model's fine. And I think in terms of end state, I completely agree with their numbers. What we're not aligned is what's the ramp. So right now, as I said, we gave out our first provisional licenses on June 20th of 2018. We opened our first retail stores. We opened 2 retail stores on November 20th. We now have 15 retail stores, and as of last week, those 15 retail stores have generated just over $70 million of total revenue, which is $14 million of tax revenue, because it's 20%. I'm not going to obviously get into a debate with my Department of Revenue. I think it's literally just, again, nobody disagrees what the long-term revenue is going to look like. It's just literally how long it takes us to get there. Yeah, I've learned better than to make an enemy of the Department of Revenue. It's not a good thing.
What is your total budget, sir?
So for the fiscal year starting July 1st, we have submitted a budget that has 3 parts to it. It's $3.3 million for the medical marijuana program, $7.3 million for the adult use program, and then $2 million for a public awareness campaign that we're doing in conjunction with the Department of Public Health, which is about responsible consumption and driving under the influence. So the total is just over $13 million that we've submitted for the fiscal year starting July 1st.
What is you mentioned that there's an entry fee and you were keeping it low. What is your entry fee?
Yeah, so our law says that our application and license fees are not intended to generate any cash. They're intended to cover the costs of administering those applications and licenses. So our license fees tend to be on average $300. An application fee tends to be on average of $300. It's slightly higher when you get into some of the higher tiers of cultivation. They're substantially higher. We have eliminated or reduced those fees for some of the economic empowerment candidates, but average $300 for an application fee and average $5,000 per year for a license fee. But again, there's significant variation. And we'll modify those. Again, we put those fees in place before we'd started the program. estimating what it would cost to process applications and to enforce licenses. And again, our objective is to make them, essentially just cover our costs and not generate incremental revenue from license or application fees.
Please.
No, did you talk about the number of staff you have?
No, I didn't, but I'm happy to. So we are right now at 60.
60
Between the medical
statewide?
program and the adult use program.
What do they do?
Well, as long as I don't have to answer the question for myself, I'll tell you what the other 59 people do.
I'm sorry, what are their titles?
So there are 5 commissioners. Our first act was to appoint an executive director who is essentially the chief executive, if you will, of the agency, and all operations go through the executive.
Dumb question, sir. Are the commissioners paid?
Are we paid? Yes, we are.
Well paid, I trust.
Well, I'm not going to.
Strike that
I will tell you.
strike
I will
it
tell you
from
the following, which is my salary is set by legislation, by the law, to be the equivalent of the Secretary of Administration and Finance. And he just got a 5% raise, so I guess I'm getting a 5% raise. But
What is his salary, sir?
before this 5% raise, $161,000 a year.
Thank you.
And the other 4 commissioners are paid 75% of the Secretary of Administration and Finance's salary. And they're full-time. They're full-time jobs. We are not allowed to work outside or do consulting or anything. And I will tell you, for the first year and a half, it has been more than a full-time job. But so there's 5 commissioners, then an executive director who reports to the commission. Underneath the executive director are some of the basic functions you have in any organization. So we have human resources, we have finance and accounting, we have IT, we have a general counsel. We have a director of government affairs. We have a director of constituent outreach. The biggest, by far, part of the agency are investigation, licensing, and enforcement. So of the 60, 20 plus are investigators that are doing background checks or looking into license applications, doing inspections of facilities, and so enforcement and investigation is the biggest single part of our agency by far.
On another day, we will speak more of MWBE. It sounds that were I to recommend to the great state of Massachusetts, I would say that the money to do your social equity may come from those 2 upstream areas that are untaxed. That's where you may, without imposing any more fees on the people, find ways of doing that. But I would never tell Massachusetts how to do their job. Are there any last points that my colleagues want to raise? Then we'll allow the commissioner to give his closing remarks. Any last comments?
No, I just really appreciate you coming here to share your experience with us, and I certainly look forward to having further conversations with you, because now I know where to find you.
No, first of all, it was my pleasure to come down.
Hold 1 second,
Sure.
sir. I
I'm
want to
sorry, I
see my
apologize.
colleagues.
Oh, I just wanted to thank you also. It's been really, really enlightening.
And thank you also. Is there a role for the pharmacist that you see that you're utilizing at this point?
Not at this point. I didn't finish my 4 big things
Right,
with
I
you.
was gonna ask that, too.
And one of them, I will say, is the role of the medical profession in this industry. So medical marijuana has been legalized since 2012 in Massachusetts. Up until recently, you either had to get a physician or a nurse practitioner to not write a prescription, because you can't write a prescription, but to say you qualify for a state medical marijuana card because you have one of the following conditions. My wife is a physician at one of the big teaching hospitals in Boston. She is not allowed to talk to her patients about medical marijuana because the hospital takes federal funding and they don't want to put that at risk. I have heard anecdotally from dozens, and I'm not exaggerating, dozens of veterans that have come back from Afghanistan or Iraq with grievous injuries that go to the VA for treatment. The VA, being federal, cannot prescribe medical marijuana. They get put on opioids and end up, losing their jobs and their marriages, and they get their lives back through medical marijuana. It's anecdotal. The problem is that because of federal prohibition, there is no research on the medical use of marijuana and benefits.
Here.
In
In the
Israel,
United States.
there is, but
In Israel, in the Netherlands, in Canada, there's
but
lots of other
In the
places.
United States, there's not, and the medical profession, either through choice or because of the organizations that they're working for, are really removed from this. And one of the downsides in Massachusetts, and I think other states as well, is that a lot of people are getting medical advice on the use of marijuana from the person that works behind the counter at the dispensary. And that's so there is a role for you guys. Unfortunately, I don't know how that role can happen until and unless the federal laws change.
See, in our program in New York State, pharmacists are required to be on duty at any time a dispensary is open.
That's not in our law. That's
You
worth.
could add that.
No, I think that's a great idea.
We should vote on it
I
right
said,
now.
so I said I'm new to state government, so I don't like sounding like a bureaucrat saying, well, not my job. The fact is, we took over the medical program just a couple months ago. We took the program over and we deliberately made no regulatory changes. We said, all we care about is ensuring there was no disruption to patients as we transferred But now we have started a process with public hearings and public listening sessions to make changes to the medical program to bring it more in alignment with the adult program where appropriate. That's a great idea. That is not part of our program.
So you do see it's important to take a closer look at the medical marijuana.
Yeah, my big objective is to somehow get the medical profession involved in this, because I think that that's the way we're going to learn how to use it and how and what's the most beneficial way to use it. But B, I think it's also the way to make sure that patients are being taken care of adequately. So I think that's a big issue.
And again, thank you for your time.
Sure.
Sir, is there any last word that you want to make?
No, I just wanted to thank you guys for the opportunity to come down here today. It is important for us, as I said at the beginning, to try to help out the states that are following us, just like we were helped out by the states that preceded us. So it's both my pleasure and honor to be here today, and I am happy to come back literally anytime it would be useful or to answer questions. We wish you the best of luck. We're all in this together. And it's hard, and so I think we need to work collaboratively and learn from one another. So I'm delighted to have had a chance to be down here today. I really appreciate the opportunity.
We're going to actually come up to Boston, I believe this is called, and see. We're going to come and tour some of the places that you spoke of.
Can
sir.
we facilitate that, or at least meet with you during that time? Do
It
you have the time yet?
would be a joy and an honor. In fact, you would keep us from getting lost. I've been told that your streets
Yeah, I know.
are...
Boston is kind of set up in a way that if you don't know where you're going, we don't want you there.
I've told that I would end up in the Big Dig or something of this nature.
There's a reason that none of our streets are at right angles to one another, and there are no street signs.
You grew up in New York, and I grew up in Boston. So
Really, it's so different than New York, which is so tourist-friendly.
I was talking to Senator Sanders. I actually think New Yorkers are far friendlier than Bostonians. They just tend to tell you exactly what's on their mind. Yeah. So do you have a date for when you're coming?
Yes.
Senator Tanner, do you have a date for when you're coming to Boston?
No, we're working on that, and I would certainly invite all of my colleagues to. I like June, a nice warm.
Well, so please give us some lead time and tell us what you want to do. We're happy to host you and take you around. If you want to go anonymously on your own, that's fine too, but we're happy to host you. And
Well, being a banking committee, we're going to the banks because that's where the money is, I was told. We certainly are going to go to the banks and things of that nature, but while we're up there, we might as well see other worthy things that you have.
yeah, we're happy to facilitate introductions or accommodations. So just please reach out when you have your date scheduled, and we'll make it work.
Well, then, we really appreciate it. On behalf of my colleagues, on behalf of the Senate of New York, on behalf of the state of New York, including our illustrious Assemblywoman, we really want to thank you for coming down here. The world
It was
is
actually
round.
pretty much straight west.
The world is round, but coming here,
sideways.
coming sideways to Albany to see us. You really, the time flew while you were here. And we really got a lot of good information from you. And if we didn't watch ourselves, I'm sure that we could stay here for another 3 hours and barely get the gist of what you're saying. But having said that, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank the entire audience. I know that you gained a lot of knowledge that no one had, and if anyone can help figure this out, I encourage everyday people to participate in this. This is your government, this is your ideas, this is your state. Under those conditions, something's going to happen. If you're not for it, then you should stand up and say that. If you're for it, you should stand up and say that. Something's going to happen, and we encourage you to participate in it. Again, this is the Banking Committee, and on behalf of my colleagues, Senator Liz Krueger, and Senator Diane Savino, who came and tried to help me sound somewhat intelligent. I really appreciate their aid. They've been leading on this issue forever. These are the champions. Diane, who is here, and Liz, who was here earlier, have been the champions for many years on this. I am a latecomer here, but I'm very grateful that they pioneered the way. Having said that, I shall say thank you and thank you. This hearing is now over. Thank you very much.
Excellent.